This is our regular meeting of the Planning Board. The first item on the agenda is the approval of minutes. The minutes from the regular meeting of September 11th and the special meeting of September 5th. May I have a motion to approve the minutes from the special meeting held on September 5th?
So moved. Second.
Motion made and seconded. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Minutes are accepted. We have a motion to approve the minutes from the regular meeting of September 11th.
So moved. Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The minutes are accepted. There is no correspondence to receive tonight. Item 3, continuances. There is one item that is being continued this evening. That is item 4C. Public hearing, application of Jack Gullison for development plan review, including requests for waivers from certain design standards of the Middletown Rules and Regulations regarding the subdivision and development of land, Section 521, for construction of a new commercial building to include an 18-room hotel with a restaurant and associated site work located on property identified as 59 Aquidneck Avenue, Assessors Plat 115 SE, Lot 169.
Mr. Chairman, I received email correspondence from the attorney for the applicant, and he is requesting an additional continuance to the November Planning Board meeting.
That's November 20.
Yes.
Yes.
Motion to continue.
Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and second to continue this item to the November 20th regular board meeting. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The item is continued. Next item on the agenda is item 4A. Review revised draft ordinance for possible creation of incentive program to promote preservation of historic buildings and resources. I will ask Ron to give a brief summary, and then the board will discuss it.
So this has been on the agenda for the past several months and hasn't been discussed because of the length of the agenda, so we decided to start early tonight to have a little bit more time to talk about this particular item. There was a public workshop hosted by the Planning Board back in May where a preliminary draft of the proposed program was presented and public input was received. And then since that time, some revisions to the draft have been made as a result of that input and also additional input from the Planning Board. And so what was included in your packet for this meeting is the latest draft of that proposed program. It's an incentive program to promote preservation of historic buildings and resources in town. It's a voluntary program. The property owners would have the option of participating or not if they have eligible historic resources. The memo that I gave you also contains some questions that arose at that public workshop and some of the answers that were developed after that meeting, whether it's talking with the town solicitor or the tax assessor. So the answers to those questions are in this memo, but then are also incorporated into the revised draft that you have. So I guess at the pleasure of the Planning Board, if you like, I can just step you through the highlights of the draft as it exists today, accept whatever input and questions you might have, and then the next step for this would be to finalize the draft and then consider scheduling a public workshop or public hearing to present it again, accept additional public input, and then at that point make whatever revisions are needed and then send it forward to the town council for consideration. So that's sort of where we are in the process. So at the end of this discussion tonight, I talked with the chairman about this. I think we'd be looking for some direction from the board in the way of scheduling a public meeting, public workshop. I'm not going to get into every detail of this. It's a standard ordinance form, has the purpose statement, definitions. On page 2, the definitions of, well, I guess they're all important, but the definition for Historic Resource Preservation Board and then also the Appeal Board are in there, as well as the definitions for the different types of resources that might be considered for eligibility in the program. You'll see further down on page 2, Middletown Historic Resources list. That would be established by the Historic Resources Preservation Board. And I guess just backing up, that board would be a board appointed by the town council, and it would consist of 5 members with 2 alternates. And the way that it's worded now with the input that we've received is that at least 1 member of that board would be a member of the Middletown Historical Society if they choose to appoint somebody. It's at their discretion, but they are being offered at least 1 seat on that board, and not necessarily limited to 1 because it's up to the town council. They'll appoint whoever they want. But the thought was you want is at least 1 member of that board to provide the input from the Historic Society. So that's in there. So that board, once it's created, would have the responsibility of finalizing a list of eligible resources, as well as coming up with the procedures and definitions for how properties would be included on that list. So as we've talked about in prior meetings, there has been research done over the years. It's dated now, but inventories of historic structures in town, and BJ is well aware of these documents. So that would be the starting point for creating the list of eligible properties. And then, as I just suggested, there would be some criteria that would be used by this board to perhaps include other properties on the list. And it's not just structures. There's also talk of allowing other resources to be eligible for funding. Viewscapes, historic stone walls are talked about in here. Other types of resources would potentially be eligible to receive the incentive. There are 2 basic types of incentives. There's a annual historic tax exemption that would be afforded to properties that are in the program. So if a property is found to be eligible and they wish to apply for that incentive, their property would be in the program for, it's suggested in here, for 10 years. And whether it's, depending on whether it's a primary or a secondary historic resource, they would be eligible for up to 10% exemption from the value, the assessed value of the property for a primary resource, and 5% for a secondary resource. One of the questions that came out, and I'm just kind of working through the ordinance here, with the notes on the side, on page 3, one of the questions that was raised during that public workshop was, well, what's the potential financial impact on the town of offering that type of an incentive? And so Kevin at the time did some research, and based on, and these are just for discussion purposes, they're not by any means final numbers, but he estimated, and it's based on some of those earlier inventories that were done, about 144 properties, and that, based on that inventory, that might be eligible for this incentive. And if you do the calculations, he estimates about a $68,000 total incentive being given, which is, taxes that wouldn't be collected otherwise. So that's, for that incentive, that's you know, the financial hit to the town if everybody, if everybody wished to participate in the program at the maximum amount, 144 properties, that's the number that we're looking at. The second type of incentive is a one-time incentive, and this would be, again, for eligible properties, and it would be up to the board to determine if the property is eligible or not. And if there was a proposal to do renovations to the property or other enhancements to the property that would retain or enhance its historic value, a property owner could apply for tax benefit of up to 10% of the cost of the project. So one of the questions came up, well, what if it's a very expensive project? Could somebody actually get a benefit more than what their tax bill is? And the answer to that is no. If you were to get that incentive, your maximum benefit for that 1 year would be your total, basically your total tax bill for the year, or the median, the way it's worded now would be the tax bill on the median home price or value in the town, whichever is less. So if you've got a very expensive property, you spend $1 million to renovate it, you're not necessarily going to get the complete value of that off your taxes. You're going to be based, once you hit that ceiling, you're going to be based on what the median home value in the town is. So that helps to limit the potential adverse impact on tax revenue. So a similar calculation was done. This is much more speculative, many more assumptions were made by Kevin as he was coming up with this calculation, as you can read. But in this particular scenario that he came up with, approximately $43,000 total. So if you were, again, to total both programs, if they were both in place and they were both being used at a pretty good rate, you're talking in the range of about $100,000 per year in tax benefits being given to the property owners that participate. So that's one of the questions that came up, because that's something that's definitely, when and if this does get to the town council, that'll be one of the first things that they're going to want to know as you're talking about providing incentives. On page 5, there's also, aside from the tax incentives, a density bonus provision at the bottom of page 5. And what that's about is offering someone who wants to subdivide their property, which happens to have an eligible historic structure on it, giving them some incentive for retaining and preserving that historic structure rather than removing it as part of a subdivision development. And what this would do is, if they were willing to do that and put a deed restriction on that structure to ensure that it doesn't get demolished, they would be granted an additional single residential unit as part of their subdivision. And that would only be allowed with major subdivisions of a conservation development design. And the reason for that is it would provide, again, the ability to have an additional lot on that property without running into the zoning issues. If it was a conventional design and the subdivision plan had basically zoning compliant lots, lot area and dimensional limitations, that would be problematic to then try to give somebody an additional lot, because you wouldn't have any way to fit it in with the existing zoning dimensional limitations. But in a conservation plan scenario where the lots are smaller than what the underlying zoning would permit, you've got the open space set aside, then there would, of course it depends on the design of each individual subdivision, but there may be the opportunity to create an additional development lot within that conservation subdivision to offer that incentive if someone were willing to do that. I don't know how often that would come up. We haven't done the analysis to see how many of these, at least the identified historic structures, are actually on properties that are of a size where you would expect a subdivision to happen. We can look at that more closely, but again, the board wanted to offer some incentive to developers who are subdividing to retain any historic structures. Then, as we get into page 6, you get into sort of the workings of the ordinance, how it's amended, enforcement of the regulations. The Historic Resources Board would have some authority. Of course, the building official always has authority. The tax assessor would have authority when it comes to evaluating whether properties are complying with the program that they've entered into voluntarily. Obviously, if they get into a program, well, it's not obvious, but the way this is worded is that if they get into the program, it's a 10-year program. If at some point during that 10 years they decide, you know, I'm out and I'm going to tear my house down, they can certainly do that, but then they'd have to refund the benefit that they received in those prior years. They're not bound, you know, for 10 years, but they would have to repay that tax benefit if they would chose to exit the program before the 10 years is up. If the property changes hands, there's no provision in I believe the solicitor was consulted on whether a future property owner, the next property owner, is bound by the agreement that the prior property owner entered with the town, and the answer is no. You can't bind that next property owner. So the property basically comes out of the program, potentially comes out of the program. There's discussion in the ordinance about informing, educating the new property owner of the opportunity of retaining the historic structure, maintaining their use of the program, but they're not required to. And there's also no clawback to get the taxes. If someone sells their property, they're not required to pay the property back if the new property owner doesn't stay in the program to pay the tax benefits back. So that was talked about at one of the meetings, and the advice was that we can't bind that prior property owner in that way, or the new property owner for that matter. Standards and guidelines on page 7. So that's, again, I talked earlier about the fact that the committee, the board, once it's created, would be creating the guidelines that they'd be using, particularly as it's worded here, for the other types of, so aside from the structures, the other types of uses are resources, landscapes, landmarks, archaeological sites. The board would have to come up with that criteria and the guidelines. The ordinance is proposing to use the U.S. Department of the Interior standards for how to treat historic structures, again, as a starting point. And then the last point on page 7, publicly owned historic resources. That was a point of discussion as to whether the ordinance would require that any structures, historic structures that meet the criteria that are owned by the town, whether they would have to be retained. I'm going to suggest that not be included in the ordinance. I think that's sort of beyond the scope of what we're doing here. We're trying to get private property owners to get into the program. It's a voluntary program, do the right thing, preserve the history of Middletown. I don't know that then adding on a provision that the town is required to maintain, the way this is worded, shall preserve structures. I don't know that that's appropriate in this type of a program, which it's really a different thing. Not to mention the fact that I don't know how much support that provision would have once it gets to the town council, so that's another concern. Page 8 is just a starting point of, what will end up being the list of historic resources. On page 9, that's the provision of the density bonus that I talked about. That would be contained under the conservation development section of the zoning ordinance. And then also on pages 10 and 11 is also, again, within the conservation development provisions and the regulations, having that provision for the density bonus. And then on page 12 is more language. At this point, Rita, after Kevin left, Rita took a shot at this and was working on it. So inserting the creation of the Historic Resources Board within the town code under boards and commissions. So again, just preliminary language at this point. As I mentioned before, the proposal at this point is for five members and 2 alternates, with the 1 member being a member of the Historical Society. Page 13 has the responsibilities of the board. So again, there's the initial responsibilities that I referenced of creating the inventory and some of the criteria, guidelines, and procedures. And then the ongoing responsibilities of the board, which would be to review projects that are being proposed for the developments or the incentives. So that's where we are at the moment.
Comments from the board?
I just have
Bill?
a question on, Ron, back to your point on page 7, the publicly owned resources. You know, I don't disagree with you. I think it's, I don't know how appropriate it is, but is it, with changing the language to, I don't want to lose that component of publicly owned structures, you know, may comply, we encourage the town to comply. I mean, at least it's a statement, at least, that, you know, we don't want to just not address it.
That's up to you. I mean, my point was that this is an incentive program for private property owners to kind of lump in the town, you know, forcing the town to retain its structures as a mandatory requirement into an ordinance that's supposed to be a voluntary incentive program. It just didn't, it didn't seem to fit.
It's evolved into an incentive program, but I think it was born of trying to protect the resources to some degree.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't disagree that it shouldn't be a requirement, but at least a statement of encouragement to comply in some way. But that's just my feeling.
What happens if the
You could have a
town,
statement of purpose in the ordinance, or the intent of the ordinance is to make it clear that the intent is to preserve. You don't need to make a distinction in that statement as to public versus private, but if that's what you want to do.
with what you're proposing, Ron, if the town later sells publicly owned historic property or historic resource to a private party, then it's their option as to whether they wish to preserve it or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, if the private buyer wished to participate in the incentive program, they could apply, sure.
Just like somebody who already owns one.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a deal breaker for me, but I just think, you know, the intent is to preserve and encourage preserving, and, you know, what we should be in some capacity trying to preserve our own house before we're encouraging others to do the same. So we're not going to require it, certainly, but a statement of support to be conscious of it for people who are looking at this maybe beyond us, that, hey, we did our homework, we did our work, and we're encouraging all properties, which can include this building right here, for one.
If you take that out, Ron, I can imagine this going to the town council and having them react with saying what's wrong with the planning board that they didn't address publicly owned historic resources.
But the rest of the ordinance is optional, so are we going to say that the town has the option or not to preserve its historic resources?
Well, I like Bill's suggestion of encouragement rather than just an option.
Yeah.
I think it should be a little more than just an option. BJ?
Yes, well, as we all know, the Historical Society does contribute a lot to the town. And there are, and this is in conjunction with the support of the town. There's the Weatherby School, the Paradise School, there's the windmill, and there, hopefully, I keep thinking the school I went to many years ago, Oliphant School, which is sort of decrepit right now. But in general, the town has been very good about helping when it's been needed. And the Historical Society is right on top of a lot of these ventures.
I'll go one step further on that and suggest that the properties that you talk about, why can't we encourage the town to seek, in some capacity, recognition as historic properties? And I think that's our duty to do that. If we're talking about historic preservation, we're talking about our own structures, our own publicly owned property.
Well, there are some very well-known ones, and talking with someone like John Grosvenor, he has Restmere, is it?
Mhm.
And they have redone that. Of course, that's private. But there are a number of beautiful homes that could qualify. But I think more like the schools and things like that, the historic ones, although some of them have been taken down, like the Howland School.
Rather than try to resolve this, could we ask that you include something and it could be discussed at the public hearing?
Sure.
Okay.
So are you thinking more along the lines of within the purpose statement, have some language?
Well, I think it would be good to have that in the beginning, that the
Yeah.
purpose is to preserve
Yeah.
the historic resources of the town. I mean, that is where we started.
I think encouraging the town to, you know, or maybe as an ongoing responsibility, seek out options for publicly owned buildings on whether or not they can or can't be designated. Do some research. If it's an ongoing project, at least we've identified. So yeah, in the purpose statement, in the intent at the beginning, but then maybe under ongoing projects or, you know, future projects that could be on their list of, quote, things to do.
Yeah.
You know, seek out.
I think if you go back to the comprehensive plan where this originated with the town council, it says that they want to preserve the town's resources.
Right.
So it applies to them too.
Okay.
And also, I must say that some of the resources are not necessarily buildings. There's a fort that's over off my Antononi,
Yep.
which is historic. Of course, all you can see really are the boundaries of it. But should someone come along and want to build something on it,
Is that private?
pardon?
Is that private, Edie?
I'm not sure if it is or not. but
Yes,
it has
it's
been-
private, yeah, it's on private land.
Green
Is it
Fort?
on
Yeah.
private land?
Yeah.
Would that affect any of, or would this affect anything like that?
Well, this is all
Optional.
optional. If a
Yes.
private property owner, if
Yeah.
they happen to have that readout on their property and they want to do something, whether it's enhance it or preserve it, whatever it is, they would have the ability to apply for the tax
Sure.
incentive.
They may dig up some cannonballs.
Yeah.
So just, that being said, that's my only suggestion. I'd like to
Yeah.
think that we support it, but I gotta give you and certainly Kevin and Rita credit. This is a very well-written ordinance. I think you've done a.
It's getting closer, yeah.
Yeah,
Getting
definitely.
closer.
So, I mean, we'll see it get torn apart maybe at the next level, but
Yep.
for what we've done and what you've done, it's to be commended for sure.
Couple
I
other,
think so, too.
couple other questions. Has Jack Kane reviewed this?
He's been given it, I don't know if he's reviewed it. I can check with him to see if he's had a chance
Because
to look at it.
at one point, that was one of the things that we wanted to have the
Yep.
building official review it. So
Yep.
could you check with him?
I will check with him.
Yeah. And just one other question on the option of adding an additional lot. The Conservation Development Ordinance is in the process of being changed to where the planning board could opt for either conventional or conservation development. If I understand what you said, the option to add a lot would apply only to a conservation development.
Right.
And if the planning board decided that they preferred the conventional development, and that would not apply. Is that correct?
Right. And again, the problem is that you'd be basically allowing somebody to put a lot into a property that's not meeting the zoning requirements.
Yeah. Okay, that's all the questions I have. Do you need a motion to finalize the draft and poll for a public
Sure, why not?
workshop? May I have a motion to request the planning department to finalize the draft and schedule a public workshop?
So moved.
I'll second it, but as we discussed with the addition of the language. As
Well, yeah, as discussed.
Sure.
As discussed.
Second,
Do I have
I'll
a
second
second? A second? Motion's made and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is item 4B, a public hearing, Prospect Avenue Subdivision, Eugene Goldstein applicant. Request for combined preliminary and final plan approval for a proposed 8-lot major subdivision of property fronting on Prospect Avenue. The property is identified as Assessors Plat 121NW, Lot 66A, and is located approximately .3 miles to the east of the intersection of Prospect Avenue and Aquidneck Avenue. Mr. Martland.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. David Martland on behalf of Mr. Goldstein. As the board is aware, this is a matter that's been pending before the board for a while. We originally received master plan approval for this.
Before you go further, may I have a motion to open the public hearing?
So moved. Second.
Motion is made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The public hearing is open. Sorry.
Thank you.
Start over.
So going back a couple of years now, just about, we received the master plan approval on February 8 of 2017 for an 8-lot subdivision on property off of Prospect Avenue. I know that the board is undertaking some site visits with respect to the property and is generally familiar with the property and its surroundings. In connection with that original approval, there were some waivers that were granted and that have made their way into these plans. And I'll have Lynn Small from Northeast Engineers kind of walk through some of those issues, but just to run through those waivers. There was a waiver to allow the installation of an asphalt sidewalk as opposed to a concrete sidewalk. And so that's been reflected in the plans, and that's something that the Public Works Department endorses, just from a maintenance standpoint. There was a waiver to provide a road right-of-way width of less than 50 feet. The frontage, as the board knows, of this particular lot currently on Prospect Avenue is 34 feet. It's 34 feet wide, and there's an easement to the west. But we've got 34 feet of width within which to put the roadway. So for that stretch coming in, there was a waiver granted to allow the reduction from 50 to 34 feet for that right-of-way. And then the remainder of the roadway expands to, or I should say the right-of-way, expands to 50 feet. The roadway, as I'm defining it, the asphalt, is much less wide. Your regulations call for 26 feet of a paved roadway. We received a waiver to go down to 22 feet, something that's also endorsed by the Department of Public Works, and there's just less asphalt and less runoff associated with the final waiver that was granted was for road construction standards at the, located sort of near Prospect Avenue. And just to refresh your recollection, if I may approach,
The mic.
With the mic, yeah.
do I need to,
Under,
at the entrance to the subdivision, there is a beech tree located on the easterly side. So in that general area, the road construction standards were modified to provide for a reduced depth in excavation and instead utilize geosynthetic material in that area to try to protect the roots of the beech tree from being damaged. So that was a waiver that was granted. There were also a number of conditions, all of which have been satisfied associated with that. Now, why has it been so long since you've last seen us? And what have we been doing? We filed plans with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, the RIPTES program, and so that took a period of time. We then came back and filed an application with this board back in September of 2017. After that filing, this matter was referred to the Technical Review Committee for its review. And along with the independent review agency, Crossman Engineering and Steve Cabral, there was a thorough vetting of the plans, which required resubmission to DEM because some of the design had changed. We also retained an expert for purposes of looking at the hydraulic features and the impact that the wells would have, and had those reports reviewed by Mr. Cabral. And so it's taken a while through all of that vetting to get back before this board. Now, the Technical Review Committee, in its review, made a vote to put forward a positive recommendation of approval subject to a number of conditions. And those conditions are laid out on page 3 of a report that Mr. Wolanski put together dated October 1, 2019. And the first condition deals with the necessity to provide appropriate drainage based on the impervious surface of each lot. And what the town is basically saying there is, I think in years past sometimes, the size of the houses and drainage associated with them and other impervious area that could be built on a lot was never really captured and calculated in the overall drainage regulations. So what we've done is we've added a note to the plans and provided a maximum impervious lot coverage for each one of the properties. It will be adopted into all of the appropriate legal documents, and that has been calculated into the overall drainage for the site that Lynn Small will explain the features of that. But the town wanted to make sure that if this was designed for 2,000 square foot home, and they ultimately ended up with 5,000 square feet of impervious surface, that, you know, a homeowner that wanted to do that would understand that they were capped at that 2,000 square feet by all the legal documents. So that's a condition that we were certainly amenable to and has been, would be reflected in all of the appropriate documents. The second was to provide for a fence around the drainage ponds, which is something that we would have no issue with. Number 3 was adding a note with respect to the binder course of pavement. That has actually been added to the plans. It's been satisfied. 4 dealt with the survey certification. That has been updated and satisfied and reflected on the plans. Number 5 is states the stormwater management and maintenance agreements and requirements applied to the development shall apply to all components of the stormwater management plan, including the rain gardens proposed for each building lot. And that is a condition that's acceptable and agreed to and would be noted on the plans as well as all of the legal documents. Number 6 is prior to final approval, the plan would be revised to identify all trees along the easterly property line where the mobile home park is, or actually along all property lines, but that's where they were really noted. That has been satisfied and addressed. And finally, prior to final plan approval, the applicant would contact DEM to determine whether the proposed detention pond is subject to the state dam safety regulations. That has been addressed and satisfied. So that condition has been satisfied. So we come before you tonight having, I think, received the positive approval from the Technical Review Committee. And I believe having satisfied the concerns raised by the independent review agency, Crossman Engineering. And obviously their job isn't to advocate for us or advocate for the town or advocate for anyone else. They're here to, as a state licensed engineer, to review the work that our engineer has done, our consultants have done, and make sure that it's appropriate, it's reasonable, and in keeping with the town's code and all state regulations. So with that, I would, well actually before I call Lynn, I'd like to address maybe some rumors that have been out in the community in connection with the mobile home park. And as you know, some of the board members may be aware and others, my client did acquire the mobile home park that abuts this property. He didn't acquire it in his personal capacity. He's got partners, and they acquired the park as an investment. Now I know that there's been some discussion of thoughts maybe raised or speculation that somehow that was going to get put into a larger subdivision and these properties would be linked in some fashion, but I just want to let the board know that that's not the case. This is, we're seeking a subdivision of this property as a standalone. The mobile home park, my client intends to continue to run it as it's being run and as its own investment. So they're not linked, other than Mr. Goldstein has an interest along with some other partners who've acquired that, but it's not part of, or going to be part of this development. So with that, if I might call Lynn Small to come up and provide testimony to the board.
Good evening.
Good evening.
And
Please identify yourself.
Right. Lynn Small, Northeast Engineers, 55 John Cock Road, Middletown.
Lynn, I think maybe the best way to approach tonight is if you could just sort of walk through the existing conditions for both the board and the members of the public for the site, what was approved at the master plan stage, and what is actually before the board this evening.
Okay. Sure thing. Ron, can you switch to the existing conditions, please? The existing site basically drains entirely to the east. The north arrow faces towards the right of the sheet on this particular site, just so we could fit it all in one plan. The access to the site is from Prospect Ave and at a narrow point where it intersects with that roadway, as we have that huge beech tree that's right on the corner. And then it opens up as you go south. To the east of the site, we have the trailer park facility, which has 2 public wells. These have been land surveyed into the project by survey location. They're not approximate, they are on ground survey. Those are their exact locations. We also located all the trees that are on that boundary. The drainage for the entire parcel runs towards the southeast corner of the project site and discharges towards the field and then runs down those slopes. We have sewer availability in Prospect Ave. We have no public water in this portion of the roadway. And we obviously have electricity that would be available. Currently, the site has no improvements on it. It's an open grass field that's often used for polo practices. The properties around the project site, to the east we have the mobile home facility, and we have residential developments on the west, north. I'm all messed up because the north's not. So the west, north, and then towards the rear of the property, or the southern portion of the property, we have a parcel that's allowed for a single-family home, but is the rest of the project area is already under a conservation easement. The proposed development, I guess I can say it here, is for an 8-lot conservation subdivision where we keep the new single-family homes at the western portion of the site with a single public roadway that runs down basically the center of the project site. We did, as Dave had mentioned, altered some of the design standards that you have for Middletown roadway construction in an effort to preserve the tree. We included additional support in that structure of the gravel base underneath the pavement, so that while we reduced the gravel depth with those geotextile materials, we'll end up with a product that's as strong, if not stronger, than your normal gravel base that you are required to have in Middletown, but it'll have a shallower cross-section so that it'll help have less impact on that root system. While we do have this pinch point for our public right-of-way, the applicant acquired an easement onto the properties that are just west of this so that we can include our utilities. We do have a sidewalk there that came out of our master plan process, that we have an asphalt sidewalk that runs around one side of the roadway. So that's reflected in that area, and you can see it on your site plans. The 8 lots, we all have enhanced groundwater recharge rain gardens. They're rain gardens, but they're specifically sized larger than normal so that they promote more groundwater recharge in this specific area, because we have wells and we want to make sure we get some of that. Normally, we do that within our drainage system, the main collection system, but due to the proximity of the public wells, basically along their western boundary, we didn't want to infiltrate, or it's frowned upon to infiltrate the stormwater after it goes through the treatment system right next to those wells. So that's why we have these enlarged rain gardens shown for each of the 8 lots.
Lynn, could I just interject for the moment? With respect to the recharging in the detention basins there, wasn't it the state that's requiring those to be lined? So there's no recharge because of the proximity to the wells?
Right, the Department of Health includes stormwater facilities in their list of things that are to maintain some separation from public wells. So even though it's treated stormwater, because it's part of a drainage system design, you're not supposed to infiltrate that water within 200 feet of a public well.
Lynn, for the benefit of everyone, could you describe what a rain garden is?
Sure. So a rain garden is allowed for residential use in the state of Rhode Island to provide water quality treatment, which you are all aware of at this point. Water quality treatment is essentially your first flush, your 1 inch over your impervious surfaces where you're getting the bulk of your dirty water. You're going to get your sediments, your oils, your greases. It goes into these rain gardens. They're essentially, they look like a depression with plantings in them. Okay, they have about 8 inches of storage, generally on the top, and they have a mixture of materials underneath, and then they infiltrate into the ground. And they provide treatment before that water intersects with the groundwater. It is one of the approved devices for water quality treatment in the state. There are other water quality treatment devices that you can use, but this is the one that is most often, as it comes right to the surface, you plant it, and it's the easiest to choose from for the most part. So as Dave had said, all of our drainage systems have to be at the low portion of the site, which means that they have to be on the eastern boundary line. Therefore, they're in our public well radius, so the entire project is lined. So it won't get into the groundwater. The other thing that you'll see on this sheet 4 is Dave had mentioned that part of the TRC was to ensure that our drainage system that we designed and got approved for this project is never overburdened. As we all know, like Dave had said, back in the day, there was less, I guess, focus on the drainage systems, and people would have a 1,500 square foot footprint thrown on a plan as a placeholder, the drainage system designed for that, and then you build a 3,000 square foot footprint. You know, so now your drainage system design is kind of off. We don't want that to happen anymore, so we put in larger footprints, and then to further ensure that each lot is not overbuilt afterwards, we include, underneath the lot area, we include the maximum impervious area that that lot is allowed to have. Now that's impervious as a house roof, a covered porch. A deck is considered pervious as far as drainage system is concerned. So if someone wants to have a bigger house than that, they do have some flexibility because they could put in a pervious driveway or something like that. But at least this gives the town officials, when they go and pull for a building permit, something very clear to measure things by. So we know that at the end, this system won't be overtaxed. We do have private wells for each of the lots. We have a, I believe it's a 10,000 gallon tank for fire. This has been placed and approved by the fire department because we don't have public water over here. but we do want to have that fire safety for the project. And I guess in the neighborhood, in the vicinity. And then we have underground electric. We do have a landscape plan that we included with some street trees within the right-of-way. That's the last sheet in our set, I think, or your set. And it does keep this birch tree in place. Beech, sorry, engineer. Is there anything else I missed?
I don't think I have it. I don't have it, sorry. No.
I do have it on a zip drive, if anyone wants me to grab that.
And that landscaping plan was submitted for the review of the tree commission. And as Mr. Wolanski has indicated in his memo, that at their meeting in July, they requested that the 2 cherry trees that were proposed closest to Prospect Avenue would be removed from the plan. So we would,
Those are the 2 closest to Prospect, right?
that's correct.
The document says Purgatory.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Purgatory.
It's over in that area.
Begins with a P.
They
Just
might be close to Purgatory as well. Yeah.
But I
Oh.
assume we're talking about the 2 cherry trees closest to Prospect.
Yes.
We'll make that clear, and assuming there's an approval tonight with that condition, that it's Prospect, not Purgatory.
It's, you've got Prospect on page 2 in the write-up. I guess it didn't catch up to the end there.
I don't think they've been removed from the plan yet, but they will be as part of the final recording.
And what types of, otherwise, the street trees that are being proposed?
Looks like we have some cedar, Japanese cedars, honey locusts, some arborvitae, screen, along the boundary line. Most of the street trees are the honey locust. In summer, spirit linden. Sorry, not.
And just one other note, there's also a portion of this lot that is going to be merged in with an abutting property, is that correct?
Yes, as part of the approval of the project, we have this very corner of the existing site will be administratively combined with the abutting lot.
Say that again, please.
This corner of the project site is combined with the adjoining property. So it's going to be administratively, now we did not administratively subdivide it off and add it to that lot. When we did all of our developable land area calculations and drainage and all of that, that was taken out of the overall project size. So we're not taking double credit for it anywhere.
Yeah, those property owners have been utilizing that area as part of the yard, and actually the prior owners were allowed to have a garden and things of that nature there. And Mr. Goldstein's agreed as part of this process to kind of just square off their property there.
That should be a condition then. I mean,
Well-
if they've agreed, we should put it in as a
Oh, it's
condition.
on the
It's on the plan.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that was submitted as part of the plan set, and I just wanted to point that out so you were aware.
And it's noted appropriately, Ron, in the plan
Yep.
that's acceptable to, okay. Thank you.
And Lynn, the properties will be serviced by town sewer, is that correct?
The properties will be serviced by town sewer electricity. They'll have private wells, and there'll be a homeowners association in place to maintain the drainage system, although easements are in place so that the town can come in if they need to. Correct.
Now, the plan itself, the lots that you proposed, they're all in accordance and in compliance with the standards and provisions of the Middletown zoning ordinance, is that correct?
Yes, the lot configurations, lot areas, lot frontage, setbacks, all those dimensional requirements have been met and reviewed by the zoning officer. There's no relief required or requested. We are asking for a waiver for the width of the asphalt of the roadway. This is a benefit to the town, to the state, and just because it's a greener design, you don't need that kind of width for 8 lots. It also results in people driving slower. If your roads are narrower, you drive slower. It's just the way it is. We added the sidewalk as a safety provision for if there's children in this development. But we do have those benefits. They also have the open space on the other side of the roadway that they can use.
And from an engineering perspective, you don't believe that there'll be any negative environmental impact as a result of the stormwater systems that you've designed?
Yes, no, I mean, the stormwater system for this project will result in an improvement. We've met all of the state criteria. This is actually enhanced to provide additional treatment, to remove additional bacteria. We're not only providing treatment for our site, but also areas that are up gradient that will drain through this parcel. So it will result in a measurable improvement from an environmental standpoint for this area.
And it's this type of development, conservation style developments in keeping with the comprehensive community plan, is that right?
That's correct, yes. It's a major subdivision being over 5 lots, so it complies with the conservation development criteria with having open space, smaller sized parcels.
I don't have any further questions for Ms. Small. I'm not sure if the board has any questions.
Are you finished with your presentation?
I have Mr. Aldinger with me, who is going to provide a presentation concerning the wells and the
Why don't you have him
geohydrologic
give
features.
his presentation, and then we'll open it.
I would prefer to go, that's gonna be a bigger discussion, I think, the wells. I'd prefer to go through some of the stuff we have up to this point, if that's okay with you.
All right, go ahead.
Is that okay with you? Should I ask now?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're
So, a few things, I have a few things, and I do wanna get to the wells, but I've got, before I forget these items, I've got some notes. I'm assuming, Dave and Lynn, you're working off of the memo that Ron dated October 1st, when you read off of, I apologize. Wow, thank you for that, Mary Beth, apologize. So, I'm assuming you read off of the memo October 1, when you were talking about the recommended conditions, and I'll get to those in a second, but I just want to back up to, and I know I don't want to revisit the master plan, but I just want to refresh my memory. It's been a few months, or years, if you will, on this. So it's no secret that I'm not a fan of concrete sidewalks, and I respectfully disagree with our public works, but if that's what they're recommending. I just have a question on, maybe you, Lynn, as an engineer. Asphalt sidewalks becomes the response, and it's a maintenance issue for the town. That's why once those are once we receive it, we own it, they become a maintenance issue. I maintain that the asphalts are, it's still a maintenance issue, but maybe less of a costly maintenance issue. Is there any program or that you might be aware of to maintain the concrete, the asphalt sidewalks? I mean, what I see, I walk around in town an awful lot, and I walk on asphalt sidewalks that are completely deteriorated, dilapidated, heaving. They're a mess. Frankly, it's disgusting to me. But it's not a big deal breaker here. I'm just curious, what can we do? I mean, asphalt is asphalt. It's not concrete. It is not as durable. Anything comes to your...
I mean, there's a few things that have changed in Middletown over the last decade or so that you may or may not be aware of. But both Tom O'Laughlin and Warren Hall, they do a lot more site inspections and put a lot more on the design engineers for the construction and build out of these subdivisions now. We're required to do inspections, and when you have heaving and breakage of asphalt, a lot of times it's not, that happens over time, regardless, right?
Sure.
But if it happens prematurely, a lot of times it's because of the sub-basement, the gravel isn't compacted correctly. And because of these inspections that they do during construction, more than what we used to do, and how they're having the engineers involved in that, you're actually getting a better quality product at the end of a project. So with all that put together, we should end up with better products that last longer.
Agreed. And
as a
admittedly,
result.
the sidewalks I walk on have probably been there longer than I've been alive, so.
And they
that's
may
okay, too.
actually, I mean, things need to be improved over time, so
Sure,
that's.
no, I understand.
that's-
It's probably less costly to do so with asphalt than.
It certainly is, yeah.
Okay, understood. So my next question is item number 3 on page 1. How did we get down to 22 feet? We've been talking 24. I believe you, it's 22 if you say so, and Ron's verified and we did this, but our practice has been to, in fact, we're reducing to 24 in a proposal to change our rules and regs. How did we get to 22 on this one? Do you recall, Ron? I don't remember how we got down to 22, but.
I can help you.
Maybe Dave
Okay.
does.
So, we originally were proposing no sidewalks. Okay?
Yeah.
This is an 8-lot subdivision with a cul-de-sac. So this wasn't a through road. It wasn't going anywhere.
Not yet.
Well, yeah, but
I understand.
you can't go anywhere, honestly.
Understood.
Given where the property of the rear is conserved, you've got stormwater systems that are gonna be built
Sure.
over here. And there are no sidewalks in Prospect. So our position was to provide sidewalks for, an 8-lot subdivision with a dead end didn't make a lot of sense. We ultimately agreed with a back and forth with the board discussion, all right, we'll include the sidewalk, and as part of that, instead of doing the 24-foot road, we go to 22 feet.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, that's my recollection as well. But I don't think they're not necessary. I think they're necessary everywhere, frankly, but personal preference. Anyway, thank you for that. So again, working off of the memo that Ron gave you, and I'm assuming you read off of the recommended conditions, and you noted four of them that are since satisfied. So I'm assuming we can strike those, Ron?
Yes.
Okay, so that brings us down to 3 recommended conditions to start with. Agreed?
Those are conditions recommended by the technical review committee, and then there's some additional
what I was getting at.
recommended conditions.
That's what I was going to get to. So those 7 have been reduced down to 3.
Right, and I haven't touched any of the additional
Okay, well, that's why I want to go.
recommended conditions.
That's right.
Yeah.
We did touch on it. We touched on the trees, number 12.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that one I'm satisfied with. But and then the wells would be the next one, but that's for another discussion. But I want to focus on the only item here that's of interest to me, and I think the other stuff is just housekeeping, is number 10. Is the boundary in there? Are you agreeable to that? Is that something that we want to make sure that you're going to address?
We've required that for other
Just wanna make sure
conservation
he's good with
subdivisions,
it,
yeah.
Yeah, that is sort of, I view that as kind of a routine item, is an appropriate item that, These certainly have that kind of monumentation.
Okay, so you're in agreement there, that's fine, I think. And then we've addressed 12 and 13 we're going to get to in a second. And my only other comment relative to this presentation is respectfully, you know we're talking about changing the ordinance to allow for incentives for residential sprinklers on fire protection. I understand that the development you're proposing now meets the fire regulations for the town. I'm just put out there on the record, I wouldn't be doing a service if I didn't speak to how passionate I am about, and I think some of us up here are, on residential sprinklers. It is an option. Cisterns in the ground may be an accepted practice, but they are problematic over time, I believe. And I would, you know, at some point, with the incentives that are coming down the road, and assuming we'll see you here for future subdivisions, I'd like to see a concerted effort to consider them. I won't go so far as to suggest that you go out and do us a study and give me some numbers, but I'd like to at least put it on the record that I think residential sprinklers need to be considered, rather than just have people stand in front of us, frankly, and say, we're going to put the cistern in and we're going to go away, and we've satisfied the requirement. That to me is not productive. I don't mean that to, you know, respectfully, I mean that to you all, but something for future reference, let's at least keep that out there.
No, I certainly understand that, and I think, quite frankly, it's somewhat difficult, more difficult in a situation where you are serviced by well water, as opposed to
Not
being,
necessarily.
well, the size of the tanks that you need to
Not
provide for each
No, it
house and the pressurization.
Well, let's not even go to that discussion. I appreciate you trying to answer. I mean, I just wanted to keep it out there, and I know we've chatted about it in the past, and I appreciate the effort, and I think I just want to keep that discussion out there for, not necessarily this, but, you know, just coming in and saying we've satisfied our fire requirements, the fire department agrees, and we're going to put a 10,000-gallon tank in the ground and walk away. It's a little bit more. It's a little more in depth than that for us, for me, for future. So I'll just leave that as it is.
And I understand the concerns, you know.
I know you do.
You know, because the first few seconds of any fire is, you know.
Agreed.
For what
you,
it's
Dave.
worth, I endorse Bill's comments about residential sprinklers, and they're not more difficult when you're using well water. Any other comments at this point before we go to the well water?
Well, I think I'd like to leave it. I have a general comment and a specific one. I've been doing this for a long time, and I thought about what I want to say tonight because I think it's important. The applicant comes in well prepared, usually with expert witnesses to testify for extended periods of time, and that's all fine. However, when abutters or other people concerned with the issue are given an opportunity to speak, they only have 5 minutes. And in most cases, they're not experts in anything related to the subject, but it's important because their homes might be near there. So what I'm suggesting is we have an imbalance. I'm not sure how to fix it, but I just throw it out there because I think it's important. I do have a specific problem with this application, and I've thought, again, a long time about this. We've been at this for a long period of time. We are required by the subdivision rules and regulations to approve 5 conditions. And I remain unconvinced that there will not be any significant negative environmental impacts from the proposed development, as shown on the final plan with required conditions of approval. And I go back and I would quote from Mr. Cabral's memo on the first page, paragraph 1. The analysis also recognizes that precise conclusions cannot be made for bedrock wells without extensive investigations of the surrounding area and wells. These detailed investigations are behind the scope of the report provided. 2.2, again, his research. Our research indicates the original assumption of 10 inches per year of recharge into bedrock is higher than expected. We concur that 10 inches per year of recharge into till is feasible. We do not agree that 100% of the till charge becomes bedrock recharge. 2.5, it is common for bedrock well capacity to diminish over time. The need to install deeper wells 500 feet or new wells to replenish lost capacity is not uncommon. The future homeowners would benefit from deeper wells. 2.6, it discusses the adjacent wells on the mobile home and other abutting units. It says, it is reasonable to conclude that existing recharge in a proposed subdivision site benefits these public wells, but interconnectivity of bedrock fissures are unknown. Therefore, definitive conclusion of impacts to these public wells or adjacent private wells is not available. And finally, at the bottom of 2.7, the analysis indicates that demand versus recharge deficits can be expected, and if adjacent wells rely upon the same recharge area, the deficits will increase. A deficit indicates that demand will need to be satisfied, diminishing the groundwater storage. So I consider all of that put together to be a significant environmental impact. That's just my opinion.
Mr. Chairman, I think we should probably allow the applicant
Yeah.
to proceed with his presentation.
I was just going to say that. You have someone who's going to speak on hydrology?
Yeah, I've got Mr. Aldinger here, present to testify and go through his report. In addition, his responses to Mr. Cabral and the further review of those issues. You know, and I understand that it is our burden to prove that there will be no significant negative environmental impact. And I think after hearing the testimony from Mr. Aldinger, as well as Mr. Cabral's review of Mr. Aldinger's work, will clearly demonstrate that there will not be any significant negative environmental impact from these 8 wells.
Do you want to bring Mr. Aldinger
Yes,
up?
if I may.
It's the PDF.
PDF.
While you're waiting, please identify yourself for the
Yes,
record.
My name is Paul Aldinger, and I'm a geotechnical engineer, geohydrological engineer, who practices engineering here in Rhode Island, out of East Providence, which is where my office is.
How long have you been an engineer?
Approximately 50 years.
And, what was your educational background before becoming an engineer?
Please talk into the microphone so it gets recorded.
Right. What was my, okay. I went to the University of Vermont, got my bachelor's in civil engineering, followed by a short stay in the military. And then after that, went back to the University of Rhode Island and got my master's degree in civil engineering with an emphasis in groundwater flow. And then I went to the University of Vermont to also get my master's degree. Then I came to Rhode Island in 1973 and worked for a company in Providence, and at the same time started working on my PhD, which I did receive in 1983. And that was an emphasis in groundwater flow as well, doing basically groundwater modeling. And have been working in Rhode Island in the area of geotechnical engineering and geohydrology for the last, since '73.
And what does that mean, geotechnical engineering and geohydrology?
Well, geotechnical engineering is basically the study of the ground to understand how to place a building, place a bridge, and design the foundation for a sidewalk, perhaps, or a retaining wall. And geohydrology is the study of groundwater flow. And that area, it's development of wells, understanding nitrate loadings on properties to understand whether or not you're likely to cause problems for groundwater. And I think that probably covers a lot of it.
Now, Mr. Goldstein retained you to review this proposal, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you prepared a report that was submitted to the board, is that correct?
That is correct.
And I think it's probably best if I just allow Mr. Aldinger to sort of walk through his report and his presentation. And if the board has any questions concerning that, I would say certainly feel free to ask those questions as Mr. Aldinger presents.
Sure. What I have is a presentation essentially of my original report as revised by a couple of letters basically in responding to some of the questions that Steve Cabral asked as he was reviewing the report and then the subsequent work. We don't have a pointer by chance, do we? Okay. How do I make it go to the next page?
Tell me.
Okay. All right. So basically, the project has been explained by David and Lynn. Is the Prospect Avenue subdivision is approximately 9.33 acres with that conveyance to the
Like
adjacent.
a laser pointer?
I don't
Sure.
think it works on
It
the...
doesn't, it won't work on the screen.
Doesn't work on the
Oh.
screen, yeah. We've been through
I
this.
tried.
All right, thank you. So after the conveyance that Dave just mentioned, it's now 9.19 acres. The town of Middletown Assessors Plat 121 and Lot 66A, bounded on the east and north by single-family residential lots with access from Prospect Avenue. We can go to that next slide, which basically is the same plan that Lynn just showed you, which shows the location of location of the wells here, the 200-foot radius, I should say, for the wells that are
Excuse
located
me.
here on the adjacent property. On the adjacent property. And then they've also located potential locations for wells on each one of those lots. All right, I think we can go to the next page. The development plans, 8 homes, 4 bedrooms, water supply wells, town sewers, with the proposed layout that we just showed. We can go to the next, please. The purpose of this work here was to assess whether or not it was likely that the wells could be developed on the site that would be adequate for 8 homes with 4 bedrooms in each home. And also to assess whether the withdrawal of the groundwater to supply these homes would affect the water levels in the established neighboring wells. And so what we did was made some site visits to review the property, collect and review some relevant geologic and hydrologic data that was available for the site, estimating the average and minimum annual aquifer recharge from precipitation, estimating the capability of the wells to provide the needed water supplies for the 8 homes, researching available information on nearby wells, and preparing a report that presents the results of that investigation and the procedures used, as well as our conclusions. All right, so in order to get a handle on the water demand, we use the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management requirements for the design of the NISDS, which is 115 gallons per day per bedroom. Since this is a 4-bedroom home that we're assuming, the maximum daily demand would be 460 gallons per day. And we used a peaking factor, which is fairly typical, of 1.5, so that the average daily flow would be 307 gallons per day per residence. So the combined maximum daily demand would be 2454 gallons per day. And now that's an equivalent, for all of those 8 homes, that's an equivalent of the continuous flow rate of groundwater of about 1.7 gallons per minute, which you may not have any feel for how much that is, but a faucet in your house is probably going to be around 5 gallons a minute. So this is not a large flow for demand. You're going to need a lot more water in a hurry, but if you actually average it over a full day's period, 24 hours, it works out to 1.7 gallons a minute. All right, so the next thing that we looked at was the geology, soils and geology of the area. If you look at the USDA soil survey for Rhode Island, they refer to the soil as Pittstown silt loam. And this soil is moderately well drained with moderate permeability in the surface layer and the subsurface, with slower permeability below that. It has a hydrologic group C with an infiltration rate of 0.2 inches per hour. This is all just approximate data that's been available and developed by the USDA. Available water capacity is moderate, runoff is medium. Seasonal high groundwater tables, they're saying here, is approximately 20 inches below grade. Surface slopes are gentle in the 3 to 8% range. The other thing we looked at is the USGS information. They have a groundwater map for Prudence Island and Newport, which we looked at. They indicate that the surface deposits in the area of this site is ground moraine, referred to as glacial till. This material is described as a compact, unstratified, poorly sorted mixture of clay, silt, sand, gravel, and boulders. This material is the stuff that the glacier just sort of made a hodgepodge, mixed it all together, pushed it on like a bulldozer would push all of this material down across the land on top of the rock. And commonly, the glacial tills, the material is right on top of the rock. And if there were other deposits, there aren't in this case, but if there were other deposits like outwash, like you have in Providence and across the bay, you might have the outwash material on top of that. And that outwash material is really good material for developing wells. This till is generally not as good as that material, but recognizing that you don't need a lot of water for a residence, it's adequate. All right, so the median thickness of this till in this area is roughly 20 feet, and the maximum reported thickness may be as much as 75 feet. The yields for small supplies, that is generally less than 5 gallons a minute of water, can be made in this material, in this till material even, with large diameter wells. We're not planning to do that here, but you can do that. Okay, so the bedrock geology, we looked at the bedrock geology map for the entire state, which was developed by Hermes and a few of his associates back in 1994, which was an upgrade of an earlier bedrock report. And they classify the bedrock in this area as part of the Rhode Island Formation, which covers really a large area of the state. In southern Rhode Island, this material consists of meta-sandstone, meta-conglomerate, schist, carbonaceous schist, and graphite. Plant fossils are also common. Okay, so now into precipitation and runoff. The source of all well water is groundwater recharge, which is the result of the hydrologic cycle. In the hydrologic cycle, the precipitation lands on the ground, becomes runoff, or is lost as evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is basically either just water that lands on the ground and gets evaporated off, or transpiration where it goes into the plants. Plants take it up and utilize it. So runoff is divided into two things: surface water runoff and groundwater recharge, or groundwater runoff. Groundwater recharge, the little equation there is groundwater recharge is equal to the precipitation minus the combination of surface water runoff and evapotranspiration. So what's the average precipitation in Middletown? We assumed that it was pretty similar to the climatological station in Kingston, where the average is 47.5 for a period of from 1941 to 1996. And actually it's been extended to over 100 years now, and I'm not sure why I didn't use that at this point, but it's in that same range of about 47.5 inches per year. And it has varied over that period from 30.8 to 70.4 inches. And there is a similar record for the Newport Middletown area. It's not as long, but it also has a range or an average rainfall of about 46 inches per year. All right, this is a diagram. This basically shows the concept of the hydrologic cycle. You know, you have the rainfall falling down on the ground. It goes either down the ground, runs along the surface of the ground, becomes surface water, maybe goes to a stream, and maybe eventually to the lake and in the ocean. It may go into the ground and get taken up by the plants in the transpiration. It may get onto the lakes or some other area and get evaporated. And then there's that other part that we're interested in, which is infiltrated, which is shown up in the right-hand corner there. Infiltration and then flows in the ground and or in the rock downward, and may eventually get to the ocean, where or a lake or a stream. You have a groundwater discharge, meaning discharge from the groundwater into the surface water. Okay, so the average annual runoff in Middletown is assumed to be approximately the same as the USGS gauging station at, on the Pawtucket River and Wood River Junction. And obviously the reason we did that is that it's, the climate is similar. All right, so for a 56-year record, the annual runoff averaged about 26.4 inches. And that was measured by Barlow and Dickman in 2001. And that represents approximately 56% of the precipitation. They also you would also then find that the evapotranspiration would be 21.1 inches, or 44% of precip. And the soil in Middletown has a lower infiltration rate than in the Pawcatuck River Basin, so we couldn't use the exact infiltration that you have in Pawcatuck, because it's a much more impervious material. It's that outwash material I mentioned earlier. So a portion of the runoff that is surface water runoff is higher, and groundwater runoff would be less. All right, so groundwater recharge. Groundwater recharge is equal to, or runoff is equal to groundwater recharge. And groundwater runoff to most unregulated streams in Rhode Island is the same as the base flow. The base flow in the basins is, that are covered entirely by till, we used in order to get an estimate of the groundwater recharge in the till-covered areas, such as in Middletown. A gentleman by the name of Rutledge in '93 developed a hydrograph separation program he called PART to do this, to try to estimate the base flow. And he applied this to the Furnace Hill Brook, which drains a drainage basin of about 4.19 square miles in central Rhode Island, and like Middletown, was entirely underlain by glacial till. What he found is that the range of groundwater recharge was from 5.85 inches in water year 66, which is one of the driest years on record, to 21.3 inches in water year 73. So the average annual recharge for the 9-year period was 15.1 inches, or 33% of precipitation. Direct surface runoff during this period averaged 13.3 inches, or 29% of the precipitation. So you can see that you've got a variation there of somewhere between 13, 15 inches. I point out here that in the town of North Kingston, they say that the amount of recharge in a glacial till deposit is, shouldn't be more than 10 inches. We believe that the 10 inches per year of groundwater recharge is quite conservative. And we also point out that the recharge, that a USGS publication indicates that the recharge rate of till governs the recharge rate that flows downward to the fractures in the underlying bedrock. We've had discussion with one of the contributors to that, Herb Johnston, who's a retired USGS individual, and he definitely feels very, he studied the groundwater in Rhode Island for better part of 50 years, and you know, that's kind of his conclusions, and it was also picked up in that USGS publication in '91. For this study, we did use an average groundwater recharge to the till of 10 inches. And that represents 22% of the roughly 46 inches of long-term average precipitation. Okay, groundwater levels in Middletown are typically close to the ground surface, certainly in this area where you have glacial till, close to the ground surface in the early spring months. Water level in 3 nearby bedrock wells have been reported to be about 25 feet below the ground surface, but I don't really know exactly how, what time of year that was taken. It's very common for glacial till deposits to have a variation in elevation pretty substantial. It can be as little as 3 feet over the year, or it can be as much as 25 feet. And the reason for that is that the rainfall falls on the ground, infiltrates, but it can't flow very fast. So as a result, it can't get down to the water table rapidly, so it starts to build up in the soil above the water table. Even if it gets down to the water table, then it can't flow away. It can't flow away rapidly. The water may flow only 15 or 70 feet in a year in the ground. It's really, really slow flow. Okay. The depth in those wells that we were able to get some information on, it didn't indicate how deep the bedrock was or what the yield was in those wells. The natural seasonal fluctuation in groundwater levels result from variation in topographic position and precipitation and evaporation, transpiration, and even tidal effects in some areas. The high groundwater elevations in the spring result from that low hydraulic conductivity of the till and the underlying bedrock. The relatively slow drainage characteristics of till and bedrock cause the shape of the groundwater table to be approximately the same as the land surface. So you'd expect that on our site here that the water surface would also be following the same general pattern as the topography does. Because of this, the general direction of groundwater flow is the same direction as surface runoff, and that is downhill, perpendicular to the topographic contours. The data from 19 long-term observation wells in Till and Rhode Island indicate that the water levels can fluctuate annually from 3 to 26 feet, and the median annual fluctuation in those wells was about 11 feet. Okay, now a little more about the hydraulic characteristics of till and bedrock. There's a few characteristics which determine the capacity of an aquifer to store and transmit water. There's the specific yield, which is the storage coefficient in a confined aquifer, is a measure of the volume of water that a saturated rock or an unconsolidated material will yield in gravity drainage. It can be expressed as either a fraction or as a percentage. Hydraulic conductivity is a measure of the rate at which water will flow through a unit volume of material under a unit hydraulic gradient. And the values are commonly reported in the units of feet per day or centimeters per second. The transmissivity basically is a product of that hydraulic conductivity and the saturated thickness. And it's commonly expressed in units of cubic feet per foot per day. Transmissivity is a measure of the rate at which an aquifer can transmit water through the entire thickness under a unit hydraulic gradient. So the hydraulic characteristics of till in Connecticut have been studied by Melville and others, and they indicate that the average specific yield can be from 0.04 for a compact drumlin till. That's a material that's been very much sat on by the glacier, to 0.28 for a surface till. The average specific yield of the surface till in the study area may be less than the value of 0.28 obtained for Connecticut tills, and it's likely to be in the order of 0.1. The average hydraulic conductivity in this area would be expected to be 2.7 feet per day for loose surface tills and 0.06 feet per day for compact drumlin till. Hydraulic conductivity is determined for till in the nearby Chepuxet River Basin are reported to be in the range of 0.07 to 47 feet per day with a median value of 0.7. And that was developed by Herb Johnston and Dave Dickerman in '85. A value of about 1 foot per day or slightly less seems reasonable for the till in this area because of that general silting material. 1 foot per day would convert to 3.5 times 10 to the minus 4 centimeters per second. All right, storage characteristics of till. How much water gets stored or can get stored in till and bedrock? And for that, we look at the groundwater map of Prudence Island and Newport quadrangles again. And that indicates that the average thickness in the area is 20 feet. The till has a capacity to store large volumes of precipitation recharge or groundwater recharge, which subsequently flows by gravity to the nearby streams and to fractures and joints in the underlying bedrock. The above data allows an estimate of till in the study area to have a minimum yield of 0.10 rather. And a cubic foot of saturated till with a specific yield of 0.1 would contain 0.1 cubic feet of water, or 3/4 of a gallon. That's in 1 cubic foot. Okay, so storage water will drain from it under the influence of gravity. Our site is 9.19 acres. So if it had 1 foot of saturated soil, that would store approximately 300,000 gallons. And if you have 10 feet of saturated soil, which we would expect we would in this case, that might be 3 million gallons of stored water. On our site, most of the groundwater would flow downward to recharge fractures and joints in the underlying bedrock, and where it is available, to sustain yields of drilled rock wells. All right, storage characteristics of till and bedrock. Again, the unit storage capacities of fractured bedrocks are quite a bit lower. Various reports report that might range from 0.005 to 6 times 10 to the minus 6, I believe it is. Here, the upper few feet of the bedrock surface, here meaning on this site, would be expected to be highly fractured and weathered. Storage capacity of these few feet of rock is moderately higher than the fresh, unweathered bedrock. Yeah, we're expecting to see a zone of fractured rock that would store a lot more water than the parent rock below it. And if the average storage coefficient for the rock beneath this 9.19 acre site is 0.001, then for each 100 feet of rock that's below the water table, you could store 300,000 to 1.4 million gallons of water. And if you have 2 500-foot wells, then the rock would store 600,000 to 7.5 million gallons. So there's a fair capacity to store a lot of water in that rock. All right, so is it likely we'll be able to develop the yield that we need for these wells? Remember, we don't need a very big yield at all for the individual wells for each home. We look at the USGS groundwater map of 65 that indicates that the most reliable source for groundwater in this area is the bedrock aquifer. And the yield of drilled wells in the area has been shown to be sufficient for domestic supplies. It should range from a 1 gallon a minute to as much as 55 gallons a minute. In the rock wells, which is what we would have here, you get your water from the intersection of the water-bearing fractures and joints in the rock, where that intersects the shaft of the well. Typically with a rock well, you take the casing down to the surface of the rock, and you may go into the rock 10 feet or so, and then below that, there's no casing. So wherever the shaft intersects these fractures, it can get water from. And the yield is really determined by the number and the magnitude of recharge that is provided by these fractures. Yields can vary substantially depending on how many of those intersecting fractures the shaft ends up intersecting with. The USGS groundwater map that was developed in '65 that I've mentioned a few times identified 10 wells within 1 mile of this site. The average yield in those 10 wells was 11.5 gallons a minute, well beyond what was needed for any whether the site here or for the trailer park even for that matter. The average depth of well is 225 feet, and the average depth of rock was 25 feet. We don't have any information on any of the neighboring private wells. Presumably they get adequate supply for the households that they serve. The 2 wells, there are 2 wells, there are actually 3 wells on that property, but 2 wells serve the needs of the adjacent trailer park, where the demand is comparatively higher than the residences. Okay, so potential on-site water development. Well, as I mentioned a few times now, water demand for those residences is relatively low. The continuous yield of only 0.21 gallons per minute, that's for each individual residence, or 1.7 gallons per minute for all 8 residences. And we added in our analysis some irrigation utilized for May to October on these properties, where we assume that if you don't have 4 inches of rain in a month, then you have to irrigate. All right, so that's what we added there. And if 6 inches in diameter, if your well that you develop is 6 inches in diameter and it's 200 feet deep, you can store, that will store 300 gallons of water. And if it's 6 inches in diameter and 500 feet deep, which I believe all of our wells on this property are going to be 500 feet deep, that's 750 gallons in storage. That's roughly 1 to 2 days supply in storage. There is a high probability that the 8 wells can be developed on site. Okay, groundwater recharge versus water use. There's residential lots here, the total square footage, 3.7 acres. The impervious area .67 acres. The rain gardens, which we mentioned a few times here, is .07 acres. Residential lawns, roughly 3 acres. Roadway and Cape Cod berm, slightly more than an acre. Open space, 4.395 acres. The stormwater system, part of the open space lot, 0.877. Total development area, 9.192 acres. Okay, so we did a water balance analysis, and we made a few assumptions in doing that. We computed the average year we computed the potential recharge for the average year with average precipitations record, the average precipitation record for that month. We used a groundwater recharge of 10 inches per year on the lawn area, the residential lots, the open space. We ignored all the precipitation falling on the roadway and the stormwater features. That's 21% of the area. 90% of the rainfall in the rain garden becomes groundwater recharge. 90% of the precipitation that falls on the pervious area of the residences is directed to the rain gardens, where 50% of it goes into the groundwater recharge. We assumed the residences assumed that average 307 gallons per day, plus the irrigation for lawns from May to October. And the results of our analysis are shown here on the next table, which you really can't read. But as you can see, what we've done here basically is for each month we have the total precipitation of 45.97, and then we look at each individual month, keeping track of the open space, how much rainfall falls on the open space, how much on the residential lawns that are pervious and those that are impervious, how much is on the rain garden. So we keep track of all of the water that falls on each of the identified sections of the property, including also the drainage system. And then we also keep track by month of how much water is used. And as I said, we did also, in that case, in all cases here, add in the required irrigation, or the assumed required irrigation. Not everybody's going to put water on their lawn, but some do.
Excuse me, I want to make sure I'm looking at the right table. Could you tell me what those circled numbers are, please?
The circled numbers?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't actually even identify that, but that is the total precipitation.
What is the number?
Oh, 2.25.
And on the bottom?
The two bottom numbers down here are the total consumption, 1.256, and then the 999 is the excess of recharge minus the use by the wells. And actually, that's what's actually on here. Total annual on-site groundwater recharge, 2.3 million gallons. Total consumption, 1.3 million gallons. And then net annual gain of 1 million gallons. We point out that there was a deficit in July, but we have a large system, we have a lot of storage. A little deficit in 1 month means absolutely nothing to this system. Okay, did I miss something at the bottom there? The previous one? Okay, yeah, it is important that we do not in any way account for the water. We account for it, but we don't include it in our analysis of groundwater recharge, any of the water that overflows the drainage system and is discharged at the the southeast corner of the property. And we're assuming that 35% of the precip actually gets recharged. Okay, groundwater recharge versus water. Okay, we have been asked. Okay, we were asked if we were asked to look at some other information where the amount of recharge was not as much as 10 inches per year. I think there's definitely I feel strongly, and people that I know feel strongly, that 10 inches per year is really conservative. However, they asked us to look at whether or not it might be less. And they showed some information of a location in Maine where they did have less, but there's lots of reasons why that was, or at least a few good reasons as to why that recharge was a lot less than 10 inches, or was some less than 10 inches. One thing that is really critical is it's a different kind of rock. It's an igneous rock that they were showing, and also there was an overlaying clay bed between the ground surface and the rock, which would inhibit the water from actually getting down to the rock. So you wouldn't get as much recharge. And also the USGS reports indicate that the bedrock is actually a better aquifer than the glacial till is in this particular area. So again, 10 inches I think is fine, but let's look at something less. And that's shown on table 2, where we have, if we have 3 inches of rainfall, recharge rather, we end up with, I'm going to read this. Okay, this line here is the situation where you have 3 inches, and again, we go by month, how much water gets in to recharge, and how much water is needed by the system, and we find that we have only about 60% of the water that we need in order to recharge the wells. However, as I said, I don't think that's realistic for this site. And then the second section here is a case where you have 5 inches of recharge. And there you have roughly the same number of the recharge, and the use is approximately the same. And when you have 7, I believe that's the last one. Yes, 7 inches, you have 40% more recharge than you have water use. All right, we were also asked to look at a case where you have a dry year, and that's shown on the next table, which I don't want to go to yet, but that's table 3, and there we used the record for a year where the standard deviation was, where the amount of rainfall for the year was 1 standard deviation below the mean precipitation. And if you have a uniform distribution, then 84% of the years would be higher than that number. So we took the record that was 1 standard deviation, which happened to be 1940. And there we had groundwater recharge of 2 million gallons in that year, and a consumption of 1.5 million gallons. So we have 25% excess for the year. I point out that there was a deficit in 3 of those months during that year, but again, we have a huge system, and we're just a small, we're taking very little out of the systems. There's a lot of storage there. So therefore, even in a relatively dry year, 25% of the excess recharge to the underlying, we have 25% excess recharge. Right, and this just is the paperwork that, the spreadsheet that we developed to come up with that number. So the effect of groundwater withdrawal on nearby wells. The wells for the residences will be rock wells. The water that they will draw from will be water in the bedrock fractures. There is really no way for us to determine easily or where that source of that water is going to come from in those wells. However, it's highly likely that the source for the overburden well is in the area around the well. That's the reason for the radius that's shown around the wells in regulatory agencies, it's because it has been demonstrated that the primary source is going to be that right around the well. That's the reason for the protection zone around drinking water wells. So based on a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, we conclude that developing the 8 bedrock wells is not likely to cause any negative impacts on the nearby wells. Because the demand is real low, roughly 2.4 million gallons per minute, the groundwater recharge of 2.3 million gallons per year ignores the groundwater recharge from the stormwater system of 1 million gallons per year. And the new wells on the west side of the site are 145 feet from the nearest well and 380 feet from the trailer park well. It's highly likely that the majority of the water from these wells, or that these wells will draw, will be coming from on-site recharge. From our analysis, we have concluded to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty the following. Drill wells have been developed in the site vicinity and reported yields of 4 to 28 gallons per minute. We're looking at less than 1. We conclude that the additional wells can be developed with adequate yield in the bedrock. There's adequate groundwater recharge to provide the required water supply, and there's also adequate storage in the bedrock aquifer. The estimated demand for 8 residents is only 1.3 million gallons per year, with groundwater recharge of 2.3, so there's an excess. There are private and public wells in the site vicinity. However, we don't believe it's likely that these wells will be adversely affected because of the water demand for these new wells is relatively small amount. They're substantial distance from the existing wells, and the recharge from these wells is likely to stay within the site boundary. Now, there was a question about the Metal Arc Trailer Park. We were able to come up with a 15-month record of the water use, and the average demand during that 15-month record was 1.55 gallons per minute. Again, a relatively small amount. Using that table with from the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, they suggest the maximum of 100 gallons per day per RV site. That would work out to, since there are 72 units, that would work out to 7,200 gallons per day maximum. That would be 5 gallons a minute, about what a faucet would yield. With a peaking factor of 1.5, that would work out to 4.8 thousand gallons per day, or 3.33 gallons per minute. If we have 10 inches of recharge per year, the radius required for that yield would be roughly 300 feet. If you use the number of 4,800 gallons per minute per day, rather, 4,800 gallons per day. It's 300-foot radius. If you use the 2240, it would be roughly 200-foot radius that it would be drawing from. Is that the end of it? Yes. Okay. So coming back to the development, that circle that's shown on here for these 2 wells is the 200-foot radius.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Oldinger?
I've got a couple. I appreciate your presentation, and I think I got most of it. I happen to be interested in aquifers. I grew up on Long Island, and there's a confirmed aquifer there, but it's measured because the glacier stopped at sandy soil, so they can go down and put test wells and so on. There's also another massive one out west, which covers several states.
Could you speak up? I'm sorry. I'm not
Yeah,
sure to hear you.
there's two aquifers I'm familiar with that live and are real. One is in Long Island, where I grew up, and another one is way out west that covers several states, and they measure it because they're worried about water for agriculture, et cetera. So what I get from this is an awful lot of water down there, but it's not in one big pool. It's captured in these fractures. Is that correct? So what if you don't have a fracture?
Well, then, if you don't have any fractures and you drill a well there, okay, you're not gonna get any water.
Please use the microphone.
Sorry about that.
We're all bad.
Yeah, if you drill a well into a solid rock, which has no fractures, you're not gonna get any water.
Okay.
But that's not gonna happen in all probability, okay? I mean, you could assume, you can make all kinds of assumptions that are not realistic. That's one of them.
Okay.
Or the one that I just made is one of them.
And the other thing the board has received is at least 3 letters from people in the area, I would say not immediate butters, but in the nearby area, who have had problems with their wells, where they've had a loss of flow and they've had to go down another 100 feet or something like that. So I just put that out there. It's a concern for us because it's a concern for the people who live there. Okay?
Okay, and they're requiring that the wells be at least 500 feet deep. There really isn't much sense in going deeper than 500 feet because you get so much pressure buildup down there, the fractures are going to all be closed, so you're not going to get any water. You know, there are some rocks, even in Jamestown, which have very, very few fractures, and you can get almost no water. I drilled a well over there for irrigation purposes, and I was lucky to get a half a gallon a minute, okay? But that's a different kind of rock.
Sure.
It's not the same as we have here. It wasn't Rhode Island Formation. This is Rhode Island Formation.
Thanks again.
That it?
Yep.
Any other questions? I have some questions. Could you put the site layout up, please, Ron? The site layout, the one that shows where the homes are.
A better copy than this one, maybe?
Well, I guess the lots are there, but they don't show up as well as on the other one. Yeah, okay. If I understand the analysis correctly, on this lot, the water flow is generally from top to bottom, west to east, both through the bedrock and the soil above the bedrock. And when you made your calculation for recharge, you used the total area of the site minus the impervious sections. And when I look at that, it seems to me that the lower half to 2/3, any precipitation falling on that is going to have no effect on the recharge of the wells for the homes.
Well, yes and no. The water goes off the site, but it doesn't go away. It's going to also infiltrate. We're not counting for any of that. But the water that leaves this detention pond is going to go off here and flow down.
Well, but for the bottom half of that area, I mean roughly that bottom half, the precipitation that falls is going to flow to the east and will have no effect on recharging the wells.
That's right. That's because
But you
somebody
didn't- you
decided
didn't-
they needed to make it
You didn't put that in
impervious.
your analysis.
Oh, yes, it's included. It's included. We didn't count on any of that water that falls anywhere in the, even the water that lands on this roadway that gets collected and gets thrown into this detention pond.
The area.
That was all discharged out there, and we
the
included it
area-
only in the case where we included it as discharge and not part of what it would be recharged.
The area that you used to calculate recharge, can you show that area to me?
It's roughly this material, this property right there.
That's the 9-point-something acres? I thought that was the...
No, 9.19 acres is the entire property after you take out this little parcel. We included the entire property, but in our analysis, all of the water that lands on this part of it is included in the analysis, but it is included as discharge off the property and not recharge. So it's not part of the water that is recharged the aquifer. Even though some of it will, we did not include any of that.
Steve, is that your understanding also?
I believe the
Steve, if you,
Mike.
you need to get the mic and come up and do the dance.
Oh, again, I'm Steve Cabral with Crossman, and Paul, correct me. But I believe the recharge area includes any grass surface, including the area from the lined ponds to the roadway.
Yeah,
Is
that's
that
what
your
I
question?
thought from the calculation.
That's
But the area below, below the road, that's not going to influence recharging the wells.
I
'Cause
think
it's
that's
gonna
what
flow-
that is what I tried to say. I'm not getting through to you, but the entire, we decided, in order to be complete, that we would include the full property of acreage in the analysis. And we accounted for the water that landed here. We calculated how much water would land here and get collected, go through the system, and get discharged. Okay? It's discharged. We accounted for it, but we didn't include it as part of the recharge. And it's the recharge that we were after.
Is that amount, is the water that falls on the eastern part of the plot, is that included in the recharge?
I believe that, it's my understanding that this grass area is included in the recharge calc,
That's
But-
what I
but
thought
not-
also.
but not what lands here, though.
Yes.
Right.
And
So I
my,
think we're all saying the same thing, because Paul is just referring to, he's not, anything that lands on the pond and discharges, he's not taking credit
No,
for.
if
But
you
this
look at-
section is.
yes, and that's a significant part of the area. And,
If it is impervious, we're not collecting the water and putting it in as recharge.
I just heard Mr. Cabral say that the area between the road and the collection area is included in the recharge rate. Is that correct or not?
I don't think this shows the drainage ditch correctly. Does it show it correctly? This is open space, but it has pervious. Is it pervious?
This area is grass between the roadway. Yes, that's all.
Okay, well then we would have included it.
So what I'm saying is the precipitation that falls on that area, which is pervious, is doing nothing to recharge the wells because it's going to flow to the east. And if that's the case,
The surface
no.
water,
Let me
Go ahead.
finish now.
Go ahead.
If that's the case, then your calculation of recharge could be off by almost a factor of 2. Which means, if you look in Table 1, even when you assume the 10 inches of water recharge, at best you're in a balanced situation. And so, I mean, that's a very marginal design.
we had the areas from Lynn as to what areas were impervious, what areas were pervious.
I understand that.
Okay? If this is pervious, the surface water would run off perhaps into this drainage ditch, but the part that is infiltrated, we would include.
Yes, and I'm saying it's not that part that infiltrates, that you include in your recharge rate, is really doing nothing to recharge the wells on the western side of that lot.
You're saying because it's down
Because it's going to
gradient?
flow to the east.
Because it's down gradient, you're
Yes.
saying? Oh, okay. That's not exactly true, because if these wells did in fact draw the water from the rock, remember, we're talking about a vertical distance between this ground surface and the top of the rock of maybe 20 feet. So if there was a demand for water in this area, it would come from the water that was infiltrated here and would go down underneath that pervious zone. So I would,
Well, on one of your slides, you made the statement that the recharge water would come from the region right around the well.
right,
You know, if these
right.
were your
If
presentation.
you look at the demand for a private well for a home, the radius that is going to need is only about 100 feet. That's why we said later on that if, in all likelihood, the area that would yield water to these wells would actually be on on this property.
Yeah.
Okay, because the radius was only approximately 100 feet.
And I guess what I'm saying is that area that you just described is only about half of what you used in your calculation.
No, I don't see it that way.
Which area?
You just said that the wells are most likely going to be supplied by recharge water by the properties on the house lots themselves, or right around that, 100 feet, something like that. And that's the western half of that lot.
Yes.
So the water that falls on the eastern half of that lot is doing nothing to supply recharge.
It doesn't need to.
Well, it doesn't need to. If you put those numbers into your table, I mean, if you take.
Well, that's why, no, I say we don't need to because we do have an excess of water recharge to the ground on this lot.
By a factor of 2, but if you take out that half of water that's on the eastern side of the lot, you're in a balanced situation. It's very, very balanced at that point. That's my point. It's very iffy, I think.
Actually, may I interject a question? Paul, have you taken account for any of the recharge that occurs to this aquifer from the west?
No.
So.
No, but.
Can I please finish?
Yes, sure. Yes.
And you're saying you don't care if there's recharge that occurs on this property in this calculation and analysis on the impact on the overall area. But have you taken into account any recharge that occurs along this westerly boundary
No.
in this analysis?
No.
You've only confined your analysis to how much water is recharged back into the area on this site. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the idea, is that basically this particular property gets a certain amount of recharge to the groundwater, and we're only using roughly half of that quantity. So yeah, it's possible that some of it is down gradient topographically, not necessarily hydraulically down gradient, however.
Agreed.
Because if there was a demand here that was drawing the water out for you pumping it out of your well, there's going to be a tendency for even the water that's here topographically down gradient to get drawn to that well if it needed to. But we're saying our calculations show that actually it doesn't need to. And this water that lands here is probably going to go off the site to the south.
I understand that you have not taken any credit for recharge coming from the west, but that was his decision in making his analysis.
Yeah, and we're
Let me finish now, okay? Do you agree that the water that is in the bedrock will flow uphill to recharge these wells? Or maybe I should say upstream, not uphill.
Well, there are a handful of comments I'd have based on Paul's presentation, but I will quickly say that Paul did do a good job responding to the concerns we had over the past couple of months. But back to your question, if there are fissures that are flowing from, well, connected, say, west to east, east to west, if the demand is sufficient at the higher property, higher ground level, it is theoretically possible that it could draw water from the east. So if there is a fissure and it's filled with water, knowing that the wells are going to be 500 feet deep and the ground only drops about probably 10 feet, it is very possible that the water will be drawn uphill.
So
It's uphill on
I
the
understand
ground,
it's
but-
theoretically possible. Are you saying it's likely?
If the demand is high enough, yes. If the demand is high enough, and if the fissures,
I have a question. You done?
Yeah, then I'm all right.
So now, Steve, now that you're up here, you just mentioned you had some comments. I'd like you to comment on that, knowing that what we just heard, and thank you for that in-depth presentation. But I'd like to hear Paul's, in some layman's terms, for the benefit of us and maybe the people in the abutters, people in the audience out there, to explain what your analysis conclusion is. I can read it, maybe a little explanation. And I know that there was a more recent email today, or just the other day, I'm sorry, last week, that confirmed a couple of final points. Maybe if you can touch on those, it might give us a little better comfort.
Yeah, okay, Paul did give quite a bit of information today, so
Yeah.
I took down some rough notes, so it may not be in a perfect order.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's okay, Steve.
But one comment I'll make is, over the years, I've looked for every possible research or literature on evaluating the recharge in the bedrock wells. And I've also spent 17 years overseeing a municipal water supply for a community of 28,000 people. And my concern about bedrock wells is based on what I've seen in communities with sedimentary rock, similar to what Middletown has. And first, let me go back to a couple of tidbits, then I'll get into the numbers. Okay, there was a statement that the most reliable source of water in this area is bedrock wells. Now, the reason for that is you don't have much of a choice. And I say that because you have this till layer that's on average 20 feet, and that's not a realistic source of water. And in Middletown, you really don't have any good surface water supplies. You don't have any, say, good gravel aquifers. So your only real source of water in rural areas is going to be a bedrock well. And bedrock wells have been used for centuries, throughout the U.S. And I grew up on a bedrock well. And of course, there are good years and bad years. There are times you have to drill it deeper. But a bedrock well is common. It can be reliable, but it can also vary considerably. So the phrase that the most reliable source of water in this area is a bedrock well does not give me a good feeling, in all honesty. Bedrock water storage. As you saw in the presentation, there's an extremely high volume of water that's in the bedrock. But as the planning board members have pointed out, just because it's there doesn't mean you can get to it. It's going to depend upon the interconnection of all the fissures. Now, as Paul did point out, the bedrock in this area is a sedimentary rock, which is known to have more fissures and interconnections. But one item to note is that the sedimentary rock in this section of the state, it's referred to as more of a metamorphosed sedimentary rock, meaning because of its age and depth and pressures, the fissures are tighter. So it's really not a true sedimentary rock. It's tighter. You don't necessarily have as many fissures, but you do have them. You do have them more than in granite. And Paul, just to clarify, Paul did mention a study in Maine. What that was, when Paul first started his study, and I knew he was involved, and we received maybe the first report, I happened to have a report that was submitted to the planning board by, I believe it was Northeast Consultants for another project. So I just relayed that PDF to Paul just to say, oh, this is a similar report that the planning board is used to, just so he would see the level of detail. It wasn't meant to be a recommendation that we were suggesting to use Maine data. It was just the Northeast report as a guide. Okay. Till wells versus bedrock wells. A bedrock well is certainly better than till, because till, especially in this area, it's going to have a high water table in the spring, but they're known to dry up in the summer, so it doesn't provide you with a stable flow. And as Paul mentioned, the hydraulic conductivity of the movement of water in the till is very slow. So a till well in this area really isn't reasonable. You really have to have the bedrock wells. Let's see. The groundwater flow is typically in the direction of the ground surface. Yes, I certainly agree with that. And there was one last tidbit I'd like to refer to is that the recharge of till governs the recharge of bedrock. And that is true. You can't have any recharge of the bedrock unless there's groundwater in the till. So recharge into the till does influence the recharge into the bedrock. Where Paul and I disagree is the percentage of recharge infiltration that gets into the bedrock. I have not, or our office has not been able to find any good study that gave us a definitive answer. And the reason is every location varies. The location of the fissures varies. But there was a comment on one of the slides that agrees with my opinion, and that is that till discharges in two directions. It discharges to bedrock, and it also flows downstream and discharges into streams. And when it comes to any USGS report, they all agree on the same thing. Groundwater, as it gets into the till, it's gradually flowing and it's going to discharge into a low point, a stream, a pond, or it's going to discharge into the bedrock. Now, there are some areas where typically it would be in an area where you don't have any perennial streams. Like in Middletown, we have a series of perennial rivers or perennial streams. Typically, that's an indication that you're getting seepage from the till or bedrock, and it's emerging onto the ground surface, creating a base flow. If you're in an area where you only have intermittent streams, that's more of a sign that any water in the stream is actually just seeping into the ground. So if we were in an area with no perennial rivers, then it would be reasonable to say that you have a higher percentage of till recharge going into the bedrock recharge. Now, in recognition of the concern we had, Paul did do a scenario where instead of having 10 inches per year recharge into bedrock, he did look at what would happen if he only infiltrated 5 inches, which is in line with, we feel, is a reasonably conservative value. And when Paul ran his analysis over, I believe it was a 1-year term, and he used the average daily flows for the 8 homes, and he assumed only 5 inches per year, there was a balance. So once I saw Paul's revised analysis in response to our concerns, then I was confident that what Paul is saying is true, that there is adequate recharge on the site, assuming our conservative values of only 5 inches per year, that the site could support itself. But as I've always said in past meetings and this meetings, is that there's a bit of a gamble, but it's a historically reasonable gamble, that the well depends on how the fissures are interconnected. And that goes back to the experiences that I've had overseeing a municipal water company, is that in the section of town where we have bedrock wells, it was very common that in time the homeowners would periodically have to dig the well deeper. And it may have been that when the wells were first installed in bedrock, they may have only been 100 feet or 200 feet. And that's why we're recommending that they go in initially at 500 feet. And I do agree with Paul that if you get below 500 feet, there's really no fissures to gain water from, because the pressures have just eliminated the presence of the fissures. So we've had a series in the past of these neighborhoods where they would have to keep drilling and drilling the wells deeper. And it would get to the point where we had public water nearby, so the community ended up extending water just to alleviate their concerns. Now, one item I'll comment is based on the town's GIS database. It does appear that the homes to the west, this neighborhood actually has town water. So this neighborhood will benefit from recharge in this area because it's not going to be consumed, assuming that these homes are tied into the public water system. Okay, I lost track of your question.
Wow, that's a,
Yeah, so you answered my question, thank you. But I do follow up, and you touched on it, you touched on 3 things to me that are key. There certainly is uncertainty, but the design, you mentioned, it's relatively conservative, and you're confident that a well at 500 feet is going to be adequate for this. But there's uncertainty in just about everything you do. That you can't be certain. There's no studies out there that you can compare to. You've tried to do your best. The experience that we heard from Paul, the experience we hear from you, I don't know what else we can do. I don't see it getting to a level of impacting environmental concerns, but if you want to just maybe touch on that.
Yes, that is true, especially after Paul, we ran his numbers, and like I said, he assumed only 5 inches per year. Over a 1 year demand, using the average daily flow of 8 homes, the numbers were essentially a balance. So that alleviated my concerns. Now, the reason there was the outcome change is the very first report that Paul submitted. Actually, Paul was very conservative in the sense that he assumed that for 1 year, every home was going to be withdrawing water at its maximum daily flow. And realistically, it's going to be more of the average. So I'm certainly confident in the numbers that Paul provided. I don't agree with all of the statements about the 10 inches and because, but the end result is yes.
That's fair to disagree or not agree, but it doesn't rise to a level that makes you concerned that there's
No.
going to be any adverse effects from this. I mean, there's
No.
inconsistencies, you're gonna have ups and downs, good years, bad years, but nothing to the level of.
True. And my largest concern, as I've mentioned in the memos, was the impact to the adjacent public wells.
Right.
You know, knowing that those 2 wells service about 72 mobile homes,
Sure.
and knowing that this land actually does recharge the aquifer that they draw water from. But it was good to hear today that this applicant actually owns those wells. So then, in essence, if there is an impact, it's the applicant impacting
It's gotta
himself.
deal with it.
So that was sort of also good to hear. And when it comes to the impact to these wells, as Paul said, no one knows how the fissures are interconnected. These wells more than likely are getting recharge from this area inside the circle. Now, at a glance, you can see that there'll be an impervious detention system, so we're going to lose that recharge. But it does have a large area to recharge. So personally, I believe that there will be adequate water for the 8 homes. The true impact to the existing public wells is unknown, so I believe these wells are at a depth of only about 136 feet. So if there is an impact, it would be on these wells. But like I said, it sounds as though the applicant would have to deal with those.
Mr. Aldegar, I want you to understand that I do appreciate your analysis. And the reason I raised my point was usually when we get an application for development, the lots are dispersed across the whole area. So using the entire area is reasonable. That was a little different in this case, so I had to ask my question, okay? Given the answers you gave and Steve's corroboration, I'm okay. Thank you for your commitment. Joe?
I have 2 questions for Steve. Number 1, so am I correct to assume the average rainfall that we looked at is just call it 46 inches a year, right? So you're saying that 5 inches of that 46 inches gets infiltrated into the, right? So is that?
Yes, I believe.
Is that that seems very conservative to me. Out of 46 inches, you're only capturing 5.
It
correct?
is, and Paul was recommending 10, but
10, no, I know.
yes, but we felt, now the reason,
What happens to that other, so 5 inches out of 46, what happens to that other 41 inches of rain?
well, a good portion is captured by the vegetation, and some of it evaporates, then there's evapotranspiration, and then the majority would just run off downhill towards the coast.
And my second question is the rain gardens. How significantly does that impact the infiltration versus a landscape setup with no rain garden?
Well, the rain gardens provide a benefit to Paul's analysis because he's able to take credit for recharge, but the real reason for the rain gardens is the State of Rhode Island Stormwater Design Manual. They have the 3 primary standards that they have would be groundwater recharge, water quality, and peak flow. Of course, the detention pond mitigates the peak flow. The reason for the rain gardens is that DEM requires in this area, it's based upon the tight soils, it's probably only 25% of the first inch. And the DEM or state theory is that if you capture the first, say 25% of every rainfall event, you're going to maintain the existing hydrologic balance. Meaning in the undeveloped state, a significant amount of water is going to infiltrate. When it's paved, it's going to wash off. So the rain gardens helps mimic the pre-development condition.
All right,
Now,
I
your
was just,
question.
again, I'm thinking of infiltration and the ability to either enhance or,
Oh, yes, the rain gardens do enhance
Right.
infiltration. They sort of force it to happen.
all right, that's really my question.
Yes, they do. And as Lynn said, they're 8 inches deep, so on each lot, the runoff from each rooftop is first going to fill that 8-inch puddle. So every rainstorm, you're guaranteed to have that either absorbed by the soil, but in the winter months, it will reach the groundwater. So yes, those are a plus. And Paul did take credit for those.
John?
Steve, I want to read this last part of your analysis. I want you to put my fears at rest. The analysis indicates that demand versus recharge deficits can be expected, and if adjacent wells rely upon the same recharge area, the deficits will increase. A deficit indicates that demand will need to be satisfied by diminishing groundwater storage. Yet you feel comfortable that there's not going to be a situation. It seems like you now feel comfortable about this whole situation.
Yeah,
There's
see,
adequate supply.
right above that statement, I addressed the different scenarios. I was trying to summarize the different scenarios that Paul analyzed. For example, he analyzed what would happen if there was 9 inches per year of recharge, or 5 inches, or only 3 inches per
Okay.
year. And again, that was done in response to our comments to show different worst-case scenarios. So, based on those scenarios, if the worst case happens, and you're not getting a balance of recharge versus demand, then the demand's going to be satisfied by diminishing storage. But the reason I was satisfied is I was more focused on the scenario with 5 inches per year of recharge over an average year of rainfall.
And after Paul's presentation, you feel satisfied that there's going to be adequate water for the new
Well,
wells and the
actually-
existing wells?
Actually, my comfort with the 5 inches per year and the average demand was based on the analysis that he provided, say, a few weeks ago. So I was not swayed by anything Paul said today. Meaning Paul didn't give any new information that altered my conclusions. My conclusion is based upon the most recent scenarios that Paul provided maybe a week or two ago.
Thank you.
Other comments? Thank you. Would anyone from the public like to speak?
I have some handouts.
Yeah.
Want me to use the clock?
Thank you.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Stephen Fagan. I live at 520 Lynn Terrace. I have written 2 letters to the planning board regarding this proposed subdivision. In them, I have provided specific citings of the sections of the zoning ordinance as originally requested by Mr. Nash at the February 2017 meeting of the planning board, where I stated that this proposal falls short and fails to meet the requirements of the zoning ordinance. Since writing those letters, I've determined that there is an additional concern as well which I would like to present now in addition to my original concerns. Highlights of the issues. First and foremost, the obvious elephant in the room is the aquifer and the potential adverse effect on the neighboring wells. I find it ironic that the use of the Conservation Subdivision Development designation increases the number of wells by 60% over the original proposal. This does not conserve the potable water in the aquifer. It exploits it. Also, where is the water that will fill the fire cisterns coming from? I believe that any major subdivision that has reasonable access to town water, and this one does, they can bring it down from Aquidneck Avenue, should be required to use that resource exclusively now and in the future for the sake of the affected neighboring wells. I also expressed concern about the lack of conservation of the stone walls and the potential degradation of the neighborhood for the abutters, and that's in my letters. But as I was looking through, and I looked at Mr. Albinger's numbers, he said there were 9.33 acres reduced to 9.192. And when I went back and I looked and to see what numbers that NEC was using, their total land area was 406,738. That's the 9.33. I've given you three things. I've given you a picture of how the lots look with rainwater and runoff. You can see that it is flowing from west to east, as said. And it's a big, there are streams that are formed. I've also included a copy of their original proposal, this here, with 5 lots. That was based on the R40 designation. And that was all they could get on there because of the dimensional requirements. I argued that it should have been 4, not 5. And there is an argument that we could make based on the section 102, proposed rules and regulations, says that for conservation development, the number of developable lots created and the overall development density is no greater than what is permitted under conventional development. To me, I would argue that's 5, not 8. But when I started looking at their numbers, I realized that they did not exclude, contrary to what Ms. Small said, they did not exclude the, that lot size that's being proportioned. I did the math calculations, 9.33 times 43,560, that is 406 and change. That is not 400. So I started to question their numbers altogether, and I went in and I looked at, and I have a comparison here from the February 8, 2017 plans, which were the ones of the master plan approval, and then the November 14, 2018. I also have provided with you at the bottom what the definition of developable land area is, which I need you to focus on, and so I've underlined the critical areas. Developable land area is the total gross area less the following. That includes D, any public or private street or street right-of-way. F, areas required for stormwater retention, detention. And G, areas required for utility easements or public utilities. Now, if you go back and you look to the top of this thing, you will see that on their 2017 calculation, and I apologize that it's so small, but I took a photo of it and I wanted to get it all on one page so you could see it. They have subtracted areas of stormwater detention, it's the third thing, 21.7. So they have a net from the gross 9.33 acres and determined that there were 7.7 lots, which rounds up to 8. However, when you look at their November 14, they have subtracted nothing. They have not subtracted for public utility easements or stormwater, so I did the math. Now, I have to say, I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in mathematics from the University of Hawaii. I have a MAT in mathematics from Providence College, and I have 28 years of teaching mathematics, primarily focusing on geometry at Middletown High School. So I have, I bring myself forward as an expert witness in the ability to do the calculations that I have come up with. I can calculate area, I can convert area using ratios, 1 inch to 40 feet, which is what they used, and I calculated what should have been in here. So let me explain what I've got here for the numbers, because that's the final part I want to mention to you. I have two columns. The left column is the one dealing with their numbers, 406,000 square feet. The right side is what I contend it should have been, 400,000. That's the 6,000 square feet that are being given to the abutter that were not subtracted, because that is the 9.19 acres, or 9.192. Now, to make it easier for you to read, the areas that I calculated and subtracted, I didn't put it in both columns. I thought that would be too busy, but the same amount is being subtracted. I measured those areas, and I calculated for the line detention basin, the sub-drain bioretention filter area. There's an existing driveway that is paved, that entranceway that you all came in when you did the site visit. So that should be subtracted because that exists, and that's an impervious surface that exists. And a utilities trench. There has to be a utilities trench. I assumed it would be about 4 feet wide, going along the entire roadway to access all the lots. And then finally, the area of the cistern. And when I subtracted it, I came up with 364,272. Now, the next line down, it says 362. That's a typo. It's 364, and I checked my calculations. So when I did the best case scenario for them, I come up with 7 lots. 7.29 is 7 lots. When I did it based on taking out the 6,000, I still get 7.16. Then there's the question of, and Mr. Wolanski and I had a discussion about this, is the existing roadway developed, or is the proposed roadway developable? It's not. We know it's not. You can't put a house on it. But it has been common practice by this board to not exclude that, that area for the roadway. But I wanted to throw it in anyways, just to see what we came up with and share it with you. And I came up with 6.84, which rounds up to 7 lots under their scenario, not excluding the property they're giving away, and 6.71. Bottom line, big picture. I don't know why the calculations, and I've gotten to this point where it's a retired math teacher that actually goes in and reads this stuff. But when I found the discrepancy, I said, well, where are the calculations? And so I know I've gone over my time, but this is very critical. This is, and I wanted to make sure this is brought up to you, that this should be 7 lots, max.
Thank you.
It's arguable that it could be 5.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else from the public? We have a motion to close the public.
No.
Yeah, I'd like to hear, can we hear from the applicant on
Oh, sure.
response to that, just to keep it open?
Sure.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, there's more.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
I want to hear you, keep it open.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jane Beezer. I reside at 155 Prospect Avenue. I'm directly across the street from the entrance to this proposed project. And I can tell you, you know, the engineer said that they didn't have any information on any of the local wells in the area, and I just say shame on you, because we do have well issues. My direct neighbor abutting me, the Shays, they had to dig deeper. I think they had to go from 125 feet to over 200 feet, and that's in the last 6 years. The McCarthy's across the street from them, their well went dry this year. My neighbor 2 doors down, their well went dry this summer. So there definitely are problems, and for them to say they don't know about the wells in the area is, that's a lot, I think. Also, you know, I take issue with Mr. Goldstein's lawyer stating that this parcel won't be connected to the RV park. When Mr. Goldstein purchased this property in 2001, his stated interest, at the time it was a cornfield, his stated interest was to turn it into a polo field, to turn it into a polo field, put up a polo barn to house polo ponies, but put no houses on it. And here we are today. So what's gonna happen in 3 or 4 years' time with the RV park that he now owns and abuts this property? That's a big question mark. I mean, I know that we don't want to tell people what they can do or can't do with their property, and that comes into play here, I suppose, but I think that the community does get to decide what its destiny is. Do we want Middletown as a community to just have more and more development and strain more of our natural resources just to appease developers? And or do we want to retain a little bit of open space and a little bit of our rural character? I believe it's the latter. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public who wishes to speak? Yes.
My name is Kevin McCarthy. I'm here with my wife Denise. I live at 188 Prospect Ave. Jane mentioned me, so I figured I'd better get up here and support her. We've lived in the 188 Prospect for 25 years, so we're well established in that area. And again, there's a lot of problems with wells up and down Prospect. If someone would walk the street and knock on doors, I bet 2/3 of the people would say, yeah, we have a good well, we keep our house going, but it's tenuous at best at times. And I'm the northwest corner abutter, so a couple of these wells are probably only going to be 300 or 400 feet from me. So I am concerned about the quality and the longevity of my well once eight 500-foot straws go in, because that's what I think a well is. It's just a straw into the aquifer. These guys, I respect everything that you guys came up here with, but no one knows for sure. And Steve, I have a question for you. In 2.7, when you did your calculation, I'm looking at your report, okay, you say in 5 inches a year recharge, average rainfall, annual demand exceeds recharge by almost 27%. I'm no expert, but I didn't see anything that was presented this evening that would refute that. And that's really all I have to say.
Again, those numbers were summarized from Paul's report. I believe that summarization of Paul's analysis was when he used the maximum daily water use over the course of a year, when he used the 1 year demand based on the average daily use. It was essentially a balance. So that number that was just read is correct, but again, that was on a max day, 365 days, which really would not occur.
Thank you. Sure, come on up.
I have a three-bedroom house inhabited by 5 people on Prospect Ave, and 307, I think that's what we talked about. I don't think so. I mean, I use more than that with a family of 5 living in a three-bedroom house. These are 2,400 square foot homes with 4 bedrooms. They're gonna have families in there. Kids are gonna take multiple showers and stuff like that. 307, again, I don't have anything to refute it. I don't have the ability to come up with the evidence, but no way. Your laundry, you do 2 loads of laundry a day, that's 90 gallons of water right there. So, anyway, that's all I got to say. It's my story and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Barbara Arietta. I'm an abutter, 136 Prospect Ave. So we talk a lot about wells, and believe me, I've lived there for 20 years and spent many a night thinking about my well and what's going on with it, and it's our only source of water, as it is for all of us on Prospect Avenue. This is our water, and that is it. It's very important. And there's so many unknowns about our wells, as you guys know, and we've talked about tonight extensively. So I just want to express my concern about my well, and I also wanted to say that a few years ago a new well was drilled up the street from me, and we noticed a change in our water, the quality of our water. I had it tested, and suddenly there was calcium in the water, which has like a white, chalky kind of substance on dishes and glasses and hair, things like that, unfortunately. So there is also a change in quality that can occur, as well as quantity, as we're talking about. So the big question is, for the board or for Mr. Goldstein or whoever, what is the recourse? What happens to me or Mr. McCarthy or Ms. Beezer? Like, what happens to us when, let's say this development goes through and the 8 wells are drilled, and then we have issues with our wells that we need to address? Who's paying for that? How How is that going to be handled? I'm hoping to get some kind of definitive answer on that tonight. If someone could speak to that.
Peter, do you want
Thank
to
you.
address that? You want to address that? That's not a planning board issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, it would be a private issue, but if the developer took some action that damaged the wells of the abutters, then presumably they would have a claim against the developer.
I mean, I've got to say, I think, you know, the burden of the planning board is to enforce the rules and regs that apply. If you don't like the rules, you need to fix them, and you don't do it here. You just can't, we don't have the ability to modify or make amendments to those rules. We've been through this a few times. I feel for the wells. I don't have a well, never lived in a house with a well, but I can't relate, but I understand, you know, how it could affect your lifestyle. But this is not the place to affect that rule change. We don't have, it's got to be done at a higher level. It's just, we have the rules that we're bound by, and much of what they've presented here shows compliance, albeit with a little bit of uncertainty. But it falls within an area that doesn't give me cause to feel like it shouldn't be approved. I support the application from that standpoint. I just, you know, we need to go higher than that.
Ron, I have a question. The question raised about the calculation of developable land, is that something that we can check, just to make sure?
I've reviewed it, and I met with Mr. Fagan. The calculation that's shown on the preliminary plan that you have is correct.
So
They
8
use-
lots is the allowed number?
Yes, and they did not exclude the land dedicated to stormwater or the roadway because that is not required. The calculation is based on developable land area of the pre-development parcel. So you do not subtract out the proposed stormwater and roads.
Well, but he said even before, hold on a second, he said even before subtracting out the roads, he still had 7 as the number. Yeah, so.
Maybe the applicant.
Yeah, I think the appropriate formula that is utilized and what's utilized with the town is you take the total land area of the property as it sits, pre-development, right? You're not looking at post-development, you're looking at pre-development to determine how many lots you are allowed under the yield formula. And you back out 20% of that land, right? Because you figure out how much there is and you back out 20% of it, which is supposed to account for the road and detention areas and things of that nature. And then you use that 80% of the land area to calculate the number of lots. So if you take the 400,000, you back out 20%, you're at 320,000 square feet, which would yield in an R40 zone 8 lots.
So
that's
according
the
to what you
formula.
said,
That's the formula in the regulations.
so you use the area before you subtract pre-development, so you don't subtract out, I'm looking at the calculation here, and he calculated total developable area before taking the 20%. You're saying that's not what the formula says?
The formula requires that you take the pre-development land area, developable land, multiply it by 0.8, divide it by the minimum lot size.
Developable area?
Yes.
Okay.
Developable land, pre-development, multiplied by 0.8, divided by minimum lot size, 40,000 square feet.
Yeah.
So when you do that calculation,
That's what his numbers seem to say,
yes,
but you're saying that's not correct.
that's what the applicant's numbers say, and that is correct.
There's, if you were calculating developable land area for conventional development, and Ron can correct me if wrong, you would do it perhaps differently, but the formula that applies for a conservation development is the formula that he just described.
That's what's required in the regulations.
Can I just point out why Ron and I differ on this?
Very quickly.
Sure. Well, D says any public or private street or street right away, okay? So that's why we had our difference. But F and G say areas required for stormwater retention, detention, and areas required. So that has to be, and it was even in their calculation in February 2017. They had it. They had 21,700, and then all of a sudden it mysteriously disappeared. Why? I'm not going to suggest what their motivation is, but I will say that the detention and retention area is larger on this plan. This plan, you've never seen this plan before. It was finalized in November of 14th of 2018. So this is a brand new plan with brand new calculations, and it does not have the required areas subtracted. And and that's why I have a copy of this. They acknowledge it right here in their initial calculation for master plan approval, and then they don't include it here. That is huge. And areas required is different from the road. The road doesn't exist, but part of it does. And so I subtracted that.
Peter, can you help us with this?
Well, I think the butter is confusing the definitions for developable land area that would take that out, and then with the formula that's applicable to a conservation development, which essentially takes that 20% out. So if you do it that way, you're essentially double dipping, you're taking it out twice.
So the correct number of allowable lots is what?
8. Is what would come out of the
I want to hear it from
yield plan
Peter.
What would come out of the yield plan formula in section 304 of the subdivision regulations.
And that's what the applicant did?
Yes.
Okay.
It says, I have the same thing right here. It says developable land area, which is defined, and it also has 0.8 divided by 40,000.
You know, we've heard from the town planner and the town solicitor about the calculation that was made by the applicant.
Mm-hmm.
They said they made the correct calculation. 8 allowable lots. Any other comments?
Move to close the public hearing.
It's called comments.
Move to close the public hearing.
Any other people from the public wish to speak? May I have a motion to close the public hearing?
If you're going to close the public hearing, there's no more testimony.
Right.
Hold on.
Right.
We have
My motion, is there a second on my motion?
Let me let the public speak. Let the public speak.
I'm Christine Fagan. I live at 5 Tonyland Terrace,
Can you move closer to the microphone, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
and my husband is passing out some data that I'll refer to as I go along. As an abutter to the Goldstein property, I object to the proposal to develop this property as a conservation development. By allowing lots adjacent to Tony Lynn Terrace properties to be clustered on 15,000 square foot lots as opposed to 40,000 square foot lots, and increasing the number of house lots and the demand on the aquifer by additional wells, this plan does not provide an improvement over the conventional development plan. According to the memo of October 1, 2019, the town planner, the board is charged with determining whether or not this plan meets all the required findings from the subdivision rules and regulations, section 403, including there will be no significant negative environmental impacts from the proposed development as shown on the final plan, with all required conditions of approval. I believe the plan will cause significant negative environmental impacts, so please consider the following points. The conservation development increases the demand on the aquifer by increasing the number of wells, putting neighbors' wells at risk, particularly on Prospect Avenue and the nearby neighborhood. There has been no concrete evidence indicating that the aquifer can support additional wells without harming the currently existing wells. And there are expectations, there are assumptions, there are educated speculations, but the reality is you don't know until you go down in and find out where the bedrock fissures are and what the yields will be. There's a lot of speculation here. So what I would ask the same question that Barbara Arietta asked, who's going to be responsible for this? And I think that it's incumbent on the board to consider that if there are implications that there could be problems for abutters. I think that's just a serious consideration that the planning board needs to take on. So while some of that is speculative in terms of the geohydraulic report, there is actual data. There are the letters that have been submitted by the folks on Prospect Avenue who are having problems with wells. There are the folks that are here that are indicating that there are problems with wells in the area. Additionally, I've provided the documentation to you regarding numerous coliform violations that have occurred at Meadowlark Trailer Park over the past 20 years, indicating recurring bacteria in the well water. This documentation is provided from the Rhode Island Department of Health website. The first two-sided sheet is a summary of recurring violations since 1996. The stapled pages document more specific information over the past 2 years, with coliform violations indicated in red. Additionally, the governor issued a boil water notice on June 11th, 2018, based on the recommendation of the Rhode Island Department of Health due to the loss of pressure in the water system at the Meadowlark Trailer Park. I provided the press release of the boil water notice. These violations are indicators of an aquifer seriously struggling to meet the current demands that are placed on it. So I think the aquifer issue in itself should be enough to reject this proposal. Additionally, this is former farmland, which is likely to be infiltrated with pesticides from many years of raising corn, and therefore likely to raise additional issues affecting water quality for the residents. The conservation development increases the amount of traffic on Prospect Avenue and the demand for town services. The conservation development causes a nuisance to neighbors by providing no buffer between the new development and the existing homes on Tony Lynn Terrace. While there is a labeled area called existing vegetated buffer on the newest rendition of the plans, this is actually overgrown scrub brush, poison ivy, and invasive bittersweet that are destroying the existing stone wall. So this is actually more of a liability than an asset, in that Middletown has committed itself to the proper maintenance of stone walls. In comparison to the original conventional development, the conservation development does not add significant open space, since the land to the east of the road was never developable. The lot is too narrow to allow for houses on both sides of the road. So who is advantaged by the open space in the conservation development proposal? Certainly not the community members at large, who are unlikely to utilize this space as part of a cul-de-sac development. It's really only the residents of the neighborhood. So based on these issues, please consider two important questions. First, does this conservation plan actually provide significant public and/or environmental benefits compared to the conventional plan? I would say no, and therefore it should not be allowed. Second, does this plan cause an environmentally negative impact on the neighbors and the surrounding areas? I would say yes, and based on that, it should not be allowed. In fact, the true goal of this conservation plan, conservation development proposal, is to increase the profit of the developer by increasing the number of house lots, not enhance the aesthetic quality of Middletown. Therefore, it should not be allowed. In closing, I ask you to consider the big picture of protecting Middletown's fragile ecosystem as a community on Aquidneck Island, and to reject this flawed conservation development proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. I got to respond to a couple of things. First, I want to say that every member of the planning board takes their responsibilities very seriously when they're considering applications, and they look at it from all of the perspectives that they are required to. Secondly, you need to understand that a conservation development does not increase the number of lots allowed. In a conservation development, the number of lots allowed is equal to the number of lots allowed in a conventional development. You also need to know that we are in the process of changing the ordinance on conservation development to allow the planning board to consider conventional developments. Right now, applicants are required to use conservation development. And we are in the process of changing that to allow the planning board to examine either the conventional or we consider both, the conventional or the conservation, and the planning board will have the discretion to choose. But that's not there yet. That's still in the process of being accepted. So please keep those things in mind. Any other comments? Any other members of the public?
I would just like
Sure.
maybe to have Mr. Oldinger respond to the issue of the loss of pressure at the Meadowlark that was referenced by Mrs. Fagan. He's got familiarity with it, and I think it would help.
Sure.
I'll be brief.
No more numbers?
We have to move on.
I don't really have any information on the loss of pressure, Dave, so I think that's just a case where the pump wasn't working correctly. But I do know something about the quality of the water that they are talking about, the defects. Those were Department of Health's inspections that turned up the bacteria in the water. And that has been basically because of the unsanitary conditions that were around the wellhead itself. And so what they had to do there is just put some chlorine to kill the bacteria. And then it takes a while before they will allow you to start using water again. So it's not a case where we have contaminated water in the ground. It's contaminated water as they're withdrawing it from the ground.
Thank you.
If I could just briefly recap, very brief.
Briefly.
All I would like to indicate is I think that we've established the 5 criteria that are required and necessary for the approval of the subdivision, that it's in keeping with the comprehensive community plan, that it's in compliance with all the standards and provisions of the zoning ordinance, that there will not be any negative, significant negative environmental impacts from the proposed subdivision, I think based on both the stormwater design and everything that was done with respect to that, as well as the review of the well information, I think shows that there will not be any significant negative environmental impacts. You've had 2 professional engineers testify regarding that. All of the lots will meet the appropriate standards and have direct access onto a public street. And they meet all of the frontage requirements. But I think we meet all of those standards, and I thank you for your deliberation tonight.
Thank you. Any other member of the public who wishes to comment?
Move to close the public hearing.
Second?
Is this part of the public hearing? No? I have a motion to close the public hearing. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Public hearing is closed. May I have a motion for a favorable recommendation on this item?
I'm going to make this motion, Ron. I know we talked about, you'll help me with it. So I'm going to make a motion to approve the application for for preliminary and final based on the October 1st memo, that it meets all of the findings, number 1, with the conditions that are laid out, the conditions, I'm sorry, I have the wrong paper.
Sorry, the October 1st.
The October 1st memo,
Yeah.
conditions that are laid out, I'm sorry, there it is. The recommended conditions 1, 2, and 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14.
And just one suggested change to number 8, where it talks about review of the legal documents. Could you also just add in review of a maintenance agreement for the proposed cistern?
Yeah.
So be it.
Yes, yes, yeah.
That's the motion.
And one other thing, so you've got the findings, the
Almost made it.
conditions. Noted in my memo, there's an additional waiver request regarding the street trees. Some street trees are being provided, but they're not in strict compliance with the standards and the regulations in terms of spacing. So even though there are street trees being provided, there's still a waiver because of the spacing of the trees.
As noted on that memo, yes, that's the motion. Thank you.
Do I have a second? What happens when there is no second?
If there's no second, the motion fails.
Motion fails.
You don't have a motion for discussion, guys? I mean, you gotta have a motion for discussion. I mean,
I'll second the motion. Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion? John?
I wanted to, can I ask Steve Cabral a question?
Sure, of course.
Steve, could you come to the podium, please? And I just, again,
Frankly,
We've
point of
closed
order.
the public hearing's been closed, so the board shouldn't be taking any other.
All right.
Shouldn't be taking any further
All right.
evidence unless you were to reopen the public hearing.
Just comment on your point.
No, that's all right. I just wanted to get something from Steve. I'm fine.
You're okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Other discussion? Joe?
One of my concerns, and I'd like to put forth as a possible condition, would be the concern on that western boundary as it abuts the residential neighborhoods to look at enhancing the screening and the landscaping. We heard about, invasive briars and the stone wall and different things there. And I'd like to see some recommendations or a condition made to enhance the aesthetics for that part of the development that abuts the residential neighborhood to the west.
Can we,
Will the maker of the motion accept that as a friendly amendment?
I will, but, I mean, I don't, yeah, absolutely, Joe. I just don't know where the applicant is on that. I don't know if we can, I mean,
It's up to the board. If you want to make it a
If we wanna
condition, you
put
can make
in
it a
as
condition.
okay, so let's be clear, I support that. Let's be clear so that they have some direction on what we're going to approve with a recommendation. So could you maybe restate that additional condition?
Paul, can you help me with that?
I think what you're
I'm the
asking,
newest guy here, so.
I think what you're asking for is some assurance that there is adequate screening
Screening, yes.
and any other, I'm not sure what else, but at least adequate screening between the residents on the western boundary and the new development.
That's correct.
Is that doable? Is that enforceable?
Yes.
It's enforceable.
Then I'll make-
It's somewhat vague right now.
So, you know what?
And what you might want to do is make it subject to a condition that the applicant provides you with a plan that the board can review to deal with that issue, so that you have it, so we're not in a situation of what are you asking for specifically and what have they met, what it is you're looking
Exactly,
for.
Peter.
So,
And
Okay
if I
with
could
you,
just
Joe?
back up to the
Yeah,
motion. Was
exactly.
the motion for preliminary approval only?
yes.
So that means that the applicant, if the board would only grant preliminary approval tonight, the applicant would have to come back for final approval, which would
Final.
give an opportunity.
Yes.
To present that plan
Correct.
for adequate screening.
Frankly, I don't recall how I said it, but that
You may
was
have
my
said
intent.
preliminary and final.
I
So
may
you
have,
may want to
Yeah.
amend, if you
So-
amend the motion, you may want to clear that up as well, that it's just
Very well. So I'll, if it's okay, I will amend my motion to, this is a preliminary approval based on based on what I had previously said. That's the only amendment to my motion, and the addition of this condition.
That the applicant
That the
come in
applicant-
with a plan for adequate screening
On the western.
on the western boundary.
Screening, including landscaping.
Yeah.
Correct, that's the amendment to my motion. You have to-
That is acceptable to the seconder of the motion.
Okay. So if you've seconded the amendment, now you take a vote on the
Yes.
amendment, and then you can
So
continue
now we
discussing
have,
the
now we
motion.
have an amended motion. Is there any further discussion on the amended
We
motion?
need to vote on the amendment.
That's what we're doing. You just asked for
You
it.
have to vote on the amendment?
Vote on the amendment.
Even
and
if
then
it's
you
a
can
friendly
discuss
amendment?
The main motion.
Even if it's a
The
friendly
motion
amendment?
as amended. Yes.
All right, so we're voting on the amendment. The amendment is to change the original motion to preliminary approval only, and then add the requirement for a plan for screening, including vegetation,
As a condition.
as a condition. Any discussion on that amendment? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The amendment passes. Now we have the amended motion in front of us.
Further discussion?
Is there any further discussion on the amended motion? All those in favor of the amendment, of the amended motion, say aye. Opposed, nay.
Nay.
So I have BJ and Art as nay. Any other nays? Okay. 3 nays.
Nay.
So that's 3 to 3, the motion fails.
Motion fails, yeah, 3-3. The next item on the agenda is item,
We take a short recess, Paul?
yeah, 5-minute recess. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. This is Dan Herkenrother from Herkworks Architecture. And I'd like to thank you for the chance to resubmit this alternative design for the exterior of the Ocean Point Church. I can go through the look. That's the images we can have before. And I also brought samples of the siding we're suggesting. After speaking with Mr. Polanski, he mentioned that it's mostly a waiver now to talk about the use of a composite siding material versus a real wood, true wood product. So I brought the sample of what we'd like to use. If I can bring that to the board.
Thank you.
So what you're looking at there are the product without any writing on it is considered, that's a cedar clapboard, and that's a solid wood product. And the one that says boral is a fly ash wood composite product. And we use that a lot on a lot of jobs now. So we're pricing this building out with those options. There's also what's called LP Smart Side, which is similar to the boral product. So this plan is showing, excuse me, traditional siding design. We're showing clapboard in the center part, and then board and batten on the gray areas. So the idea was we're going to show traditional siding around the building. It's cladding the existing metal building, and this traditional siding will look like a board and batten and clapboard. We're just asking for permission to use that boral product or the LP Smart Side product. It results in a savings around $50,000 when applied to the whole building, and that adds up.
Say again?
It results in a savings of about $50,000 to use the boral or the LP Smart Side versus a true wood cedar clapboard.
I want to remind the members of the planning board that this application does not meet the requirements of a development plan review, so we are only considering the waiver request, which is the material.
Like it. Motion?
Yeah, I'll accept a motion. For a favorable recommendation.
So moved.
It would be an approval of the waiver.
Approval of the waiver, so moved.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? I have a couple of comments. First of all, this is, I think, a dramatic improvement over what was submitted the first time around. And secondly, I would like to make a request. This is not a requirement, it's a request from the planning board, and that is, if you look at your neighbor to the west, which is Wendy's, they recently did a renovation, and you'll notice they put up a very nice screen of the equipment on the roof. That is a requirement in the town ordinances, okay? We are acting only on the waiver, but I would like to request that you seriously consider putting a screen up to shield from view any equipments that you have on your roof. And there are some up there now. I don't know what the plan is eventually, but please consider that.
Sure, yeah, it's a valid request. Right now, what we're looking at is the same locations of equipment. They're going to be 3 feet higher, so.
Well, in which case I would make it a stronger request, but it's
Correct.
still a
So
request.
if it's visible from the street, it will not be seen. We'll definitely have that.
Yeah, because you can see it from the street now, and if it's going to be higher, it's still going to
Correct.
be visible. So
Yes.
please consider that request.
We will, yes.
Thank you. Any other discussion on the motion?
I like it. Makes it count.
All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion passes. Thank you.
Fits in nicely. Fits in nicely, thank you.
One day,
Well, there's a net.
me.
Who do you think?
Oh, the vote is 5-1. We will take up one more item. Item 4F, application of Ralph Plum for waivers from certain design standards of the Middletown Rules and Regulations regarding the subdivision and development of land, section 521, for conversion of an existing building to a restaurant located on property identified as 499 East Main Road, Assessors Plat 113, Lot 27. Floor is yours.
If I could, maybe just to start, it's kind of hard to read the plan on the screen, just to describe what it's showing. The two top pictures there are the existing front and back facade. The bottom two are what's being proposed, and I believe, I wasn't at the last meeting, but I believe the discussion focused around the windows on that front facade, where an earlier rendition removed several of the windows. This latest rendition, as you can see, provides for faux windows, and of particular concern to the board, I believe, were the three windows, the larger windows above the front door. So this revised design includes those windows. They're not true windows, they're the faux windows.
Simulated.
Whatever word you want to use.
Faux.
Yeah.
Faux window.
Faux.
Faux windows.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah, so the new plan represents our discussion from last time, and a comment to the window, the simulated or faux window above where it says signage and below where it says signage. If there were a window there, there's going to be an AC unit, an air handler, well, I should say an air handler for heating and moving around cooling, right in that attic space. Right below it is where that wall partition that I mentioned, where the town of Middletown, we have to put an interior wall there. So just as an example, that's why those are like that. The one to the left of the entrance, that is there's an ADA bathroom in there. Is currently there were bathrooms in the building, but they were not even close to ADA. And then on the west elevation, those two simulated or faux windows that are just they're not really visible from the roadway at all. They're just visible really to the hotel. That's where the kitchen for the proposed restaurant's going. So that's why those are there.
Questions?
Instead of actual windows.
Yeah, go ahead.
Grills, 6/6, they're not shown on the plan. Is the plan to show the grills? They don't show any, the existing window on the right shows grill, 6/6.
To put a grill in that, certainly we could put a little thin strip if that's something that you wanted to see. I don't know if that would.
Yeah, all the windows show 6/6 windows except for the ones that are going to be faux. So I think they need to have grills.
6/6, yeah.
6/6.
So make that a condition in the motion.
You follow me?
I follow. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's great what you did. I like the addition of the simulated faux windows, but I think the grills are part of the window as much as the simulated effect. The grills make it, frankly.
We could certainly do that.
Motion?
Any other comments? Have a motion?
The other thing was the ramp.
I'm sorry.
The other item was, we tabled last time, was the ramp versus the lift. I was asked about that, why we moved it. Frankly, again, the biggest issue is if someone comes, there might be a delay in getting the person, because we're not going to let the public operate a lift. We'd have to have an employee do it. Maintenance issues with it, if it broke down, having access, stuff like that. So, because we used to have one at our current restaurant, and that's, in speaking to the operators, my parents specifically, they actually had to get rid of it just because of all the problems and issues. So that's why we like to do it with a ramp, so people can come and use it without having to, have a staff member or someone help them and assist using it. So that was the other thing that we didn't finalize last time.
Okay, any comments on that? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, my question is whether or not you're going to follow the landscape plan that the tree commission gave you.
Yes,
Thank you.
we submitted that and then gave it to our landscape team.
Okay,
100%.
fine, because I'm certain they'll be looking for it.
100%.
Thank you.
I'm sure they
Thank
will
you.
be.
They will be,
And
they'll be haunting you.
Any other comments or questions?
You have addressed in the site plan, the raised traffic calming speed hump.
Yeah.
We put it in there.
Thank you.
You have a motion for a favorable recommendation.
So moved with the
Approve.
condition that the faux windows contain, all of the faux windows contain grill works to match existing.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Ralph.
you.
Thank you, nice job, thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much.
Ron, do you want to just mention something about the long-term town revenue and tax relief, the fact that a meeting is coming up where people...
Yeah, I had emailed the board, as we were asked to do. All the town boards received notification of that hearing or the meeting that's coming up on the 28th, and offer board members the opportunity to suggest opportunities or ideas for raising revenue in the town, non-tax revenue. So whether it's individually or as a body, you're able to submit those recommendations. If individually you want to send comments in, get them to me, and I'll just forward them on to Sean Brown. If the board as a body wants to discuss it tonight and submit something more formal in the form of a memo to the council, you can do that as well.
Yeah, there is a meeting at Gaudet
Yeah.
later this month, and I
Yeah.
just proposed tax relief, anybody over 75 total. I'm 76, by the way.
Anyone want to discuss it tonight, or just have people go to the meeting? Go to the meeting. Okay, let's, people will go to the meeting and express their views individually.
Or if you have views that you want to
Yeah.
get to the council ahead of time, you can get them to me and I'll
Yes.
transmit them.
Yeah, email them to Ron. Any comments on the status report of planning board action items?
You don't have any?
Any comments? No?
You don't have any?
I don't have any. I like the report. this
Just a
time.
brief one on the airport subcommittee. We met last Thursday, and our planner and assistant planner have done a great job drafting the airport hazard overlay language, and that's going to be circulated, Ron, shortly, right?
The November
Yeah.
20th meeting, we should have the draft on the agenda, yes.
Right.
Yep.
So we've more or less, as a subcommittee, wrapped it up. So,
In 2 meetings, that's a record.
yeah, don't waste any time.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of saving time, when I look at the committee reports, does anyone have a committee report? BJ?
Yes, and I think it's probably something that most of you know, that John Kempenar had passed away. And because he had passed away, the property that is at the opposite end of the Valley Park that belonged to him, I believe will be coming to the town. And the Tree Commission has been asked to consider expanding the trees in the Valley Park when this happens. And they're very excited about the possibility.
Thank you.
On Rural Village, if you read the paper, you know the News family has purchased the Schaub's property.
Yay.
The Schaub's property will probably operate for 2 or 3 more years in its current form as a nursery.
Yeah.
And we have yet to get anything out of the Chris or John on things they want. I'm getting a little impatient. They're going to say it's Christmas coming and all that stuff. But so I don't know what we need to do.
Well, I think maybe give them another chance. I can email them again and request some time with them. If they aren't responding, then it's up to the subcommittee and the planning board to decide if you wish to proceed.
In other words, we could decide this is going nowhere.
Or you can go ahead and draft the ordinance without the participation of the property owners.
Well, that's true.
Come back, at the next meeting, come back with a recommendation.
Well, you know, maybe we can springboard something off of use table, because we might. I mean, maybe that's to come up with a blueprint for them, take it by and say what they think. What do you think?
No.
Good. All right.
We got our hands full.
We'll get right on that.
We got our hands full. I do, I think our use table is we've got a lot on our plate. I don't know if that's.
You know, what I suggest, Art, is that you just put down some bullet points and go talk to them and see if they're interested. If they're not, let's just drop it.
Okay, all right.
Okay?
Yeah, that's the better way, I think.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Okay, the only other thing I have is on the Quinnipiac Planning Commission. I want to get away from the Quinnipiac Planning Commission for a variety of good reasons. There's some bizarre things that happened, and I just can't do it. So if somebody else wants to pick up the reins and run with it, that's great.
I'm interested in that.
So what you would have to do is, since you were appointed by the town council, you would have to submit a resignation memo to the town council, and then they would decide if they're going to fill the slot and who they would fill it with.
Okay, I can just handwrite something out and hand it
Get it to Wendy.
Wendy?
Wendy, yeah,
It's
or
not a
Karen.
planning board position though, right? It just happens to be he's not.
Right, yeah, it has nothing to do with the,
Right.
it used to be that they were planning board members that served as the town's representatives,
Right.
and that's not the case anymore, but Art was appointed by the town council.
So if you're interested, you should go talk to the town council.
I'll wait until he resigns, then they'll advertise it.
Yeah, he submits the memo, they'll receive the resignation, and then they'll advertise for an appointment.
Right.
Yeah, when I cut out the company car, I said, that's it.
Meal allowance.
Merrill?
We had a meeting today of the Marijuana Regulation Subcommittee where Peter introduced us to Dwight Merriman, the consultant, nationally known consultant on drawing up regulations and zoning, and gave us some really great insight. And we started to hone in on where he thought we could have the power to really regulate over what the state might. DBR is going to try to take over this, and they probably will, but there is some wiggle room for us to make some crucial decisions about having the compassion centers in Middletown, because they plan on increasing those to 6 more across the state. So we have been charged with coming up with plans to really tighten up the regulations on that, and we're going to have, hopefully next month, a report from Dwight and Peter.
A draft, we'll
Yeah,
hope by next meeting, which we plan for mid-November, to have a draft of an ordinance for the subcommittee to review that would deal not only with the existing uses allowed under the current medical marijuana statute, but also anticipating the uses that might come if legalization was approved.
So Compassion Center on Prospect Avenue.
Any other committee reports? For upcoming meetings, I just want to point out that our next meeting is November 20th, which is the third Wednesday rather than the second. If you recall, at the last meeting, we moved it to November 20th.
I might have a conference, I know I do, on the 13th, but the 20th is good.
November 20th is the next meeting. And you're going to be doodling for to set up some other meetings.
Always. That's what I do, I doodle.
May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Meeting is adjourned.
Yeah, this meeting at 6 o'clock.